Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is a story about what if Deku had a secret quirk. If you guys enjoy this movie, comment down below and let me know before I start. Please do support for more awesome content. And leave a like and don't forget to subscribe to my channel and also share this video with your friends and check out the description in my playlist. The author of the story Crackman from AO3. So let's start the video. When he woke for the first time, he was suspended in a vast emptiness. He didn't know how old he was, and the sensation of feeling like both an infant and an adult was unnerving. For someone who had just been born, he was surprisingly coherent. He couldn't see or hear anything, but there was an overwhelming sense of otherness that consumed him, as if this vast nothingness around him wasn't all there was. Suddenly, the void warped, and he was forcefully pulled into existence. Colors invaded his vision, and he hissed as the unfamiliar sight burned into his eyes. His senses were assaulted, and he thrashed, trying to find some sense of safety and familiarity. His arms, legs, and body collided with walls and other surfaces, each contact causing pain or discomfort. When the world stopped spinning, he found himself in unfamiliar surroundings, still unable to distinguish anything, despite his vision now working. The first thing he decided to do was take stock of the situation. Making a mental list, he slowly went down it and asked himself these questions: do I know where I am? The answer was a definitive no. He knew, somehow, that he was in a room, but he didn't know how he got there and couldn't see anything. He put his hands on the surface below him and jolted when a soft material met them. It felt nice, and he unconsciously rubbed it back and forth as he thought. Abruptly, he realized that he couldn't see anything because it was dark. The room was pitch black. Now, his agenda was to find a light source. He abandoned the soft material and blindly reached his hands out to the side. On his left, his hands banged into a wall and he winced. On his right, though, there seemed to be a nightstand. He felt along the top of it as he searched for a lamp, and after a few seconds, he was successful. This time, he had the foresight to clamp his eyes shut as he flicked the lamp on. Even through his eyelids, the light was unbearably bright. He looked away from it and slowly wrenched open his eyes, allowing them to adjust. He could see the room now. It was a small bedroom, with the walls, and even the ceiling, covered with the image of a man. The colors red, white, blue, and yellow were splattered everywhere, and he was overwhelmed. Whoever lived here loved this man. Everything was neatly arranged and ordered. Sure, there were some clothes and other things on the floor, but it was fairly clean. Underneath the window sat a bookshelf with more figures of the man with yellow hair. Inside it was more interesting. It was filled with children's books, and there was one singular notebook sitting in between them. From where he was sitting, he couldn't make out the title, but the spine was titled Number 1. This room was clearly not his own. He paused. Did he even have his own room? Unnerved by this revelation, he brought his focus back to the second item on his mental list. Who am I? He didn't know. Foolishly, he expected the answer to pop into his head, but there was nothing. His mind was utterly blank, and his breath started to speed up without him realizing it. There was no useful information stored in his brain, and he curled into himself as he realized he knew nothing. He knew basic things, like how to speak, how to move, what his arms and legs were called, and the names of many objects, but he always drew a blank when the important things were considered. He didn't know his name, age, family members, or location, and he would really like to know who the man on the walls was. He also knew that he was a male, but other personal details escaped him. He felt overwhelmed. A wave of terror washed over him as he realized how little he knew. His chest felt heavy, and his body started to shake. Calm down, he told himself, but even as he thought, he felt more and more panicked about his situation. It built up in his chest, and eventually manifested its way into tears. They slid down his face as he curled up into a ball in the corner of the bed. Eventually, he cried himself to sleep. As intelligent and mature as he was still only 4, even if he didn't know it yet. The next time he woke up, it was still light outside. He sat up from a position he didn't remember laying down in and winced when pain shot up his arms. Rolling up the sleeves of his shirt, he grimaced as purple bruises revealed themselves. Again, he had no idea how he got them. These lapses in his memory were really starting to bug him. A few seconds later, he heard footsteps approaching the room. The door opened just as he pulled his sleeves back down, and he was greeted by a woman with green hair, wearing a floral dress and a bright smile on her face. "Oh, Izuku, you're home. I didn't even hear you come in." She had a spatula clutched in her hand and a mouth-watering smell wafted into the room. "How was school, honey?" He didn't know what to say, but somehow the words naturally came out of his mouth without him even having to think about it. "It was good, Mom. We watched an All Might movie." "Who is All Might?" She smiled fondly and walked into the room to ruffle his hair. "That's nice, Izuku. Dinner will be ready soon. It's Katsuden." "Thanks, Mom." She smiled again and walked out, shutting the door behind her. His grin immediately dropped and he stared blankly at the wall ahead. How did he know what to say? He had never seen that woman in his life, but apparently she was his mom. She had called him Izuku, but the name didn't trigger any feelings or reactions in him. It wasn't a bad name, but it wasn't right. It didn't feel like his. He put his identity problems to the side for a moment and decided to get up and explore. The first thing he noticed was that he was really small. There were tiny steps next to the bed so he could get on and off, and he was just slightly taller than the bed when he stood next to it. The furniture in the room towered over him and he struggled to reach the doorknob. When he finally opened the door, he looked out into the hallway. On his side, there was the bedroom door he was in and another door, and on the other side, there was only one door opposite his. He could see that it was another bedroom, presumably his mom's. He patted down the hall and into the door next to his. It was a bathroom, and thankfully there was a step stool that helped him reach the mirror above the sink. He made eye contact with his reflection and froze. He had green hair like his mom, which wasn't all that surprising. There were freckles dotted across his face, and he had huge green eyes. What was surprising was the fact that he was young, very young. If he had to place his age, he would say he was around 4 or 5. The problem was, he didn't feel that young. He couldn't describe how old he actually felt, but it definitely wasn't 4. "Izuku," the woman called. "Dinner is ready. Come eat." He sighed and yelled back, "Coming," before reluctantly climbing down and walking out into the kitchen. It was small but cute. The living room was to his right, and everything looked very lived in. There were pictures of the two of them lining the hallway and the walls. And as he sat down at the table to eat, he felt a strange disconnect from the situation. He didn't feel anything toward the person who was supposedly his mother. He didn't even feel like a child. A thought occurred to him. "Mom." He internally cringed at the title. "What's your name?" She looked surprised. "My name, 𝐻𝐸𝐻. How come?" "No reason, just curious." Finally, he had something else to call her besides mom. He just didn't see her as his mom. It might be weird, but everything right now was weird. The night went by, and the two of them chatted easily. He was polite but quiet through most of the conversation, only interjecting to get answers to the questions that he had for 𝐻𝐸𝐻. They went about their nightly routine together, and when they were finished, he was told to brush his teeth and get ready for bed. He did exactly as he was told, even if it pained him to do so. He was tired, but he managed to convince 𝐻𝐸𝐻 to let him use the computer one last time before bed. She thought he wanted to watch a video of this 𝐻𝐸𝐻 guy, so she pulled it up and left to go do the dishes before she went to sleep. It was through the video that he found out that 𝐻𝐸𝐻 was the man on the walls. He was rescuing people after an attack of some kind, and the person recording was freaking out. He had to admit that it was impressive, even if he wasn't immediately obsessed with him like Izuku was. This made a new realization dawn on him. This body was named Izuku, but Izuku wasn't him. For some reason, he felt completely comfortable in this body. It was his, but the name wasn't. Izuku loved 𝐻𝐸𝐻, his mom, and other things made for children because Izuku was a child. But for him, it was different. This body was his, but he wasn't Izuku. He didn't love 𝐻𝐸𝐻. He didn't hold any strong feelings for 𝐻𝐸𝐻, and children's books were boring. He wasn't a child, but at the same time, he was. He was so confused. One thing he knew he needed to do, though, was choose a name. If he wasn't Izuku, then he needed something else to call himself. Checking over his shoulder to make sure 𝐻𝐸𝐻 wasn't coming back, he quickly looked up a website full of names. Scrolling through the list of names was boring, and he was quickly becoming disheartened. Just as he was about to click off, his eyes locked onto one of them. Mikumo, specifically, the spelling with the kanji mei and yun, meaning beautiful and cloud, respectively. He immediately loved it and claimed it as his own. Soon enough, he was tucked into bed and drifting off to sleep, his thoughts calm but still running with questions. Izuku woke up in bed, dressed in his pajamas and feeling full and satisfied. He sat up and frowned, confused. Did his mom change him? His heart dropped. If she did, that meant she saw the bruises that 𝐻𝐸𝐻 had left on him. He didn't want 𝐻𝐸𝐻 to get in trouble. Panicked, he got out of bed and rushed into his mom's room, climbing on her bed and shaking her awake. "Izuku," she mumbled. "What are you doing? You can't get 𝐻𝐸𝐻 in trouble." He didn't mean it. He cried, worried. 𝐻𝐸𝐻 sat up and pulled him into a hug. "Honey, what are you talking about? Did you have a nightmare?" Izuku whimpered, confused. Nightmare? What was she talking about? Didn't she see the bruises? Unless, "Mom, did we have dinner?" 𝐻𝐸𝐻 frowned. "Yes, honey, we had katsudon. Remember?" No, Izuku did not remember. Katsudon was his favorite. He definitely would have remembered eating it. Deciding not to worry his mom, he just told her he did, and slid off the bed and out of the room with a muttered goodnight. As he sat on his bed, his mind was running a mile a minute. The last hour of his memory was gone. He desperately wanted to do something about it, to talk to someone about it, but he knew no one would believe him. Instead, he just burrowed under the blankets and went to sleep. Mikumo's eyes opened, and he scowled. Walking out into the kitchen, he saw that the same dishes that he had just used were in the dishwasher, and everything was cleaned up. Obviously, some time had passed, but not a lot. If he had to guess, only about 10 minutes had gone by since he went to sleep. Mikumo was no expert, but he knew that waking up, naturally, 10 minutes after falling asleep wasn't normal. So, instead of going back to bed, he snuck back to the computer and continued his research. Somehow, he knew that if he went back to sleep, he would just wake back up again. He learned that this world had these things called quirks, which were basically superpowers. They manifested around 4 years old, and there were many different kinds. Briefly, he wondered if he was a quirk. He was 4, and seemingly appeared out of nowhere in a house that he had no memory of, in a body that he didn't remember. That was impossible, though. He was sentient, he was real. There was no way he was just a power that manifested. But sentient quirks existed. They existed, and that meant that there was a very real possibility that he was one. 𝐀𝐦 quickly learned that sentient quirks were rare in the first place, even amongst the millions of quirk users. He read multiple first-hand accounts of people with sentient quirks and shifted uncomfortably at how many things were similar between them. The idea that he wasn't even real, but a quirk, was extremely unsettling. He couldn't completely accept it and decided to wait until the next time he woke up to deal with it. It was almost 6 a.m. when he finally fell back asleep, and his mind never stopped thinking. Over the next week, 𝐀𝐦 kept waking up at odd hours. Most of the time, he would wake up at night after falling asleep in the morning, but sometimes he would wake up around 4 p.m. or multiple times in a row. Every time, though, he would have more bruises. He didn't know how he was getting them. During the night, he would never leave the house and only spent his time doing research. Luckily, 𝐀𝐦 hadn't caught him using the computer at night. When they did talk, it was usually brief, as it was normally nighttime. When he woke up while it was still light outside, she would ruffle his hair and ask him questions that he didn't know the answer to. How was school? Did you and 𝐀𝐦 do anything interesting today? What did you learn? 𝐀𝐦 didn't remember going to school. He didn't know who 𝐀𝐦 was or what he learned. Apparently, he was going to school during the day while he was asleep. But was he really asleep? By now, he had accepted the fact that he was a quirk, but that meant that he had to manifest in a person. If 𝐬𝐡𝐢 wasn't him, then that meant that 𝐀𝐦 was 𝐬𝐡𝐢's quirk. If that was true, and he really was 𝐬𝐡𝐢's quirk, then that meant that 𝐬𝐡𝐢 was awake and walking around when 𝐀𝐦 wasn't aware, and the only time that he wasn't awake was when he was asleep. His eyes widened in realization. Of course, whenever 𝐀𝐦 went to sleep, 𝐬𝐡𝐢 would wake up, and when 𝐬𝐡𝐢 slept, 𝐀𝐦 woke up. That's why he always woke up at night, because that's when 𝐬𝐡𝐢 went to bed. This required more research. The next couple of nights were dedicated completely to experimenting. Whenever he was awake, 𝐀𝐦 took note of the time and fell back asleep. He knew that 𝐬𝐡𝐢 would wake up, wonder why he was awake, and then just go back to bed. When he woke up again, he would look at the time, figure out how much time had passed since he fell asleep, and mark it down in a notebook that he had hidden under the mattress. No normal 4-year-old would be able to lift a big mattress like his, so it was the perfect hiding spot. Along with timing the switches, 𝐀𝐦 also tested his physical abilities. He figured that since his mind was so much older than 𝐬𝐡𝐢's, his physical abilities might be as well. He was right. One day when he woke up in the afternoon, he begged 𝐀𝐦 to let him play at the park. She caved, and the two of them walked over to the small playground near the apartment. She sat on a bench and read a book while 𝐀𝐦 ran around looking for things he could break. It was the most logical way to gauge how strong he was compared to a normal 4-year-old. Eventually, he came upon a stick that was laying on the ground. From the point where it broke off the tree, he could see that it was still green inside, meaning the branch was fresh. The kid probably tore it off not too long ago. Fresh branches were harder to break because they bent instead of snapping as dead branches did. The branch was around 2 inches, or 5 centimeters thick. It was big, and 𝐀𝐦 was fairly positive that a preschooler wouldn't be able to break it. He held the branch with his hands about shoulder width apart and started to push. He was aiming to fold it down enough to where it snapped, and he could feel his muscles straining. Slowly but surely, the branch started to bend further and further. Cracks started to form near the bend, and he could see the green starting to show. After what felt like forever, the stick snapped and 𝐀𝐦 dropped the broken pieces to the ground. It was definitely hard, and he could feel his hands aching from his grip, but he did it. 𝐀𝐦 concluded that he was stronger than a 4-year-old. He wanted nothing more than to keep pushing himself, to keep testing, but he knew that he had to stop for the day. Even though breaking the branch was hard, it wasn't the most difficult thing he could do. He knew it. He knew he could break something stronger, but he was tired and 𝐀𝐦 was already getting up. They walked back to the apartment and she immediately started on dinner, and he ran straight for the computer and looked up a bunch practice tests that schools used. If he couldn't assess his physical abilities, then he would assess his mental ones. Already, he knew that it wouldn't be preschool level. He didn't feel like an adult, but he wasn't a child either, nor a teenager. Sometimes he would feel like a child, considering he was physically 4, but it was more in an emotional way. He got overly upset when things didn't work out, excited and hyper when he thought about Santa, and he would cry a lot. Occasionally, He would feel a flash of fear when the all-night nightlight wasn't plugged in and would get thoughts about monsters under the bed. 𝐀𝐦 knew it wasn't rational, but his mind and his body would often contradict each other. He knew that monsters and Santa weren't real and that he had no reason to dwell on those things. But his childlike emotions were getting in the way. Multiple online tests later, and he learned was supposedly on par with the first and second years in high school in terms of academics. He excelled in math, physics, science, and any class that included numbers. English was above average, while history and literature were just average. Still, it was very impressive, and he assumed he would only get better as time went on. Any math-related subject he loved. The answers came to him so naturally that he had to take more tests. He loved word problems, especially in physics. Being able to calculate the exact trajectory of an object, or the perfect amount of work needed to move something would come in handy. Most of the time, he didn't even need to use a calculator. Other things interested him, such as strategy. There weren't any standard strategy tests, so he had to go to other websites and forums. Hero fans would often talk over different strategies, and sometimes even post strategy questions with imaginary scenarios, such as how can you get all of the civilians out safely? Or a villain is going to kidnap a bystander, but other people are in more danger. What do you do? He loved coming up with ways to get everyone out safely, and even apprehend the villain, too. Riddles and logic puzzles kept him busy, and he didn't even notice that the sun was starting to peek through the windows. 7 a.m. crept up on 𝐀𝐦 quietly, and he was exiting the bathroom after one of his few breaks when he bumped into 𝐀𝐦. "Oh, Izuku," she exclaimed. "I was just coming to wake you up." 𝐀𝐦 had never stayed up this long before, and he quietly panicked about what to say. "I couldn't sleep." 𝐀𝐦 smiled lightly. "That's okay. I'm sure having some breakfast will perk you right up." She led him into the kitchen and helped him climb into the chair. As she rummaged through the fridge, she huffed and stood back with her arms crossed. "I was sure we had some leftover rice from yesterday. I guess I'll just make some more." He hunched over guiltily. When he was awake, he assumed he didn't get hungry too often because Izuku always ate during the day. But when he did get hungry, he could only eat leftovers as he was too short to reach the stove. The two of them ate breakfast in relative silence, which allowed 𝐀𝐦 to panic in the privacy of his own mind. Never had he stayed awake long enough to eat breakfast. And since he didn't have anywhere to sleep, he would be going to preschool instead of Izuku. He hoped that there was somewhere to nap so they could switch. He didn't want to cause any long memory lapses for Izuku. 𝐀𝐦 was too busy taking tests to think about what it was like for Izuku, but the silence made the thought overtake his mind. Did Izuku remember anything he did? He didn't think so, since he couldn't remember anything Izuku did. That meant that once they switched, Izuku wouldn't remember having breakfast or walking to school. He would be totally confused. Did Izuku even know that 𝐀𝐦 existed? Probably not. He had come upon an article once, on one of his many nights surfing the internet, about how quirkless people were treated. If Izuku didn't know that 𝐀𝐦 existed, then he probably thought he was quirkless. 𝐀𝐦 froze as he remembered that quirkless kids were often bullied. Was that where Izuku got the bruises from? Bullies? It was likely, and the thought made his guts churn. He was silent the whole walk to the preschool. 𝐀𝐦 was visibly worried but didn't mention it, and only told him to have a good day before she walked back home. The school was actually pretty big, and he followed one of the teachers into the building. Thankfully, there was only one class, so he didn't have to figure out which one Izuku was in. There were desks, but there were also colorful beanbags and other fun chairs. Everything was bright, even the carpet. The other kids looked to be sitting wherever they wanted to, so 𝐀𝐦 plopped himself down into a purple beanbag and fidgeted. He felt like a new kid in a new school, even if he technically wasn't. All of these kids were 4 or 5, so why was he so nervous? 𝐀𝐦 zoned out as the teacher made them repeat a song to help kids learn about the 47 prefectures of Japan. He wasn't sure this was preschool material but sang along with the class anyway. His eyelids started to droop about an hour into class, and he seriously considered falling asleep and switching right then but held out when he thought about how freaked out Izuku would be. He had never met Izuku, obviously, but he still felt protective over him. Izuku was only 4 years old, and he got bullied and beaten up for being quirkless. 𝐀𝐦 didn't seem to know about it, so someone needed to protect and comfort him. The dilemma of whether or not he should tell Izuku that he had a quirk was a hard one, and one he had been thinking about for a while. On one hand, Izuku wouldn't think he was quirkless anymore. He would have someone he could exchange notes with every shift, and maybe with a little training, they could learn to switch on command, or even share a mindscape. On the other, Izuku was only 4. Telling him that another person was living in his body and had control over it could be traumatic. It might even lead to Izuku refusing to sleep because he didn't want 𝐀𝐦 to have control. That didn't mean that 𝐀𝐦 couldn't comfort or protect Izuku. He would just have to do it without telling him that he was his quirk. Eventually, he decided that he would wait until Izuku was older to tell him. It might not have been the best idea, but he didn't want to risk his only link to the outside world being cut off. He would support Izuku from the bullies another way. Perhaps he could leave encouraging notes or get him gifts. Although, it might be a bit creepy for a 4-year-old to get gifts in his room from a random person with no idea how they got there. That was a dilemma for another day. It took all of Makumo's self-control to stay awake, and by nap time, he was yawning and his eyes were watering. He was practically sleepwalking to his assigned mat and didn't even put his backpack in his cubby. He just plopped down and closed his eyes. He couldn't explain why, but his mind was telling him that something was off. The moment he closed his eyes, the world faded away and he was in the dark. Katsuki glared at Deku as he napped. Why was the stupid nerd acting so weird today? He barely even smiled at all. Katsuki glared at him across the room for the whole class, but he didn't even notice. He growled as he was forced to look away from the idiot and go to sleep. He swore he would figure out why Deku was ignoring him. After his nap, Izuku yawned and opened his eyes, expecting to be in his room. A jolt of fear ran through him when he didn't recognize his surroundings. Belatedly, he realized he was in his classroom, laying down on his mat for nap time. The teacher had already noticed him, though, and walked over. "Izuku, you're supposed to be sleeping. Please lay back down." He looked up at her with wide eyes.
"How did I get here? What do you mean?" she asked. "I don't remember coming here." The teacher sighed and frowned. "Izuku, I don't have time for games. Lay down and nap, okay?"
Without waiting for a response, she got up and walked away. Izuku was left on his mat, laying down but wide awake. He forgot something again. Why did it keep happening? His eyes roamed over the classroom and coincidentally made contact with red ones. Katsuki was glaring at him hatefully, and Izuku flinched before quickly turning over and shutting his eyes. He never actually fell asleep, but managed to relax for 30 minutes before the teacher told them it was time for recess. He was successful in avoiding Katsuki for 5 minutes before he managed to corner him behind one of the school walls. "Deku, why are you ignoring me?" Izuku backed up against the wall and trembled. What are you talking about, Kaken? Don't act like you don't know. You didn't even look at me." "Why?" Katsuki yelled. "I don't remember." Angrily, he surged forwards and grabbed Izuku's shoulder, tiny sparks popping from his hands. Izuku winced hard as the heat singed his shirt and lightly burned his shoulder. Katsuki squeezed tight. "Do you think you're better than me or something?" "No," Izuku exclaimed. "Good, because you're not. You're just a quirkless Deku." His hands sparked a little more, and then he walked away. Izuku was left behind the wall with tears streaming down his face. He sniffled and wiped his tears away with his sleeve. Kaken was a bully. He knew that, but he was feeling so tired he didn't really have the energy to do anything about it. He just sat there, leaning on the wall and breathing slowly in and out. It took a few minutes, but eventually, the sounds of the other kids running and playing around him started to dim and all he could hear was the steady beating of his heart in his chest. Before he could close his eyes and drift into sleep, he heard the teacher calling his name. Reluctantly, he stood up and shrugged on his jacket to cover up his burnt shirt, and walked back inside with the class. Izuku tried to pay attention, but his mind was cloudy. At last, his mom came to pick him up and they walked home. Immediately after walking through the door, he told her he was tired and went to his room to sleep off his troubles. Makumo opened his eyes, realizing that he was back home, but didn't immediately get up. He used this time to relax and stretch. Even though he was anticipating the pain in his arms, he almost cried out when a particularly nasty wound pulled when he stretched. He knew for a fact that a wound so painful wasn't there when he fell asleep during class. So he quickly got up and pulled the collar of his shirt down to check it. There was a first-degree burn on his shoulder, and Makumo grimaced. It had to be caused by a quirk, considering he was only burned in one spot and his shirt was singed. Thankfully, he knew it wouldn't blister, but it looked like a harsh sunburn. Aloe vera wouldn't do anything for this. He needed actual burn cream. Makumo rummaged through the bathroom cabinet as quietly as he could inside when he couldn't find any cream. If he didn't use it, the burn would get irritated and take longer to heal. A thought popped into his head. What if he could keep a drawer in Izuku's room stocked with first aid supplies and other small things that he might like? It was less creepy than notes, he figured. The only problem was that he needed the money to do so. The first thing he thought of was getting a job, which he couldn't do. He was 4. Only shady people would hire a 4-year-old, and even then it was iffy. The next thing he thought of was taking money from 𝐀𝐦. Even if his morals were slightly skewed, he'd feel too guilty to steal from her. She was nice and kind, and he didn't want to take the money that she had worked hard for. The third option was pickpocketing. This was probably the best option because no one would expect a 4-year-old to have the guts or smarts to steal. He could very well just steal straight from the store, but they had cameras and he would rather not get caught. Pickpocketing it was. The apartment was on the 3rd floor, and they had an alarm, but luckily there was a gutter that ran down right next to his window. He was light enough to where it wouldn't break, and agile enough to climb up and down when he needed to. At least he hoped. After dinner, 𝐀𝐻𝐬 said goodnight to 𝐴𝐻𝐬 and waited until she was asleep to throw open his dresser drawers and look for a disguise. Most of the clothing was childish, as was expected, but he managed to find a black hat he could tuck his green hair into. He found some basic black sweatpants and a long-sleeve black shirt that he layered over a normal t-shirt. It got a little chilly outside, so he raided the small closet that was near the living room and found a gray scarf that he wrapped around his neck.
All set and ready to go, he piled some pillows under the blankets to make it look like he was still there. It was cliché, but it worked. He slid the window open and looked from the drain to the ground. It was far. His hands started to shake as the nervousness set in, and he carefully maneuvered his top half out of the window and gripped onto the gutter. 𝐀𝐻𝐬 was slightly shocked when he could hear the groan of the metal under his hands. Maybe he was stronger than he thought. Careful not to crush the metal, he pulled himself forward so his feet could plant themselves on the windowsill and finally dropped out of the window. His heart jumped into his throat as his short legs swung down and dangled above the ground. His grip was starting to dent the metal, and he snapped out of his shock and quickly wrapped his legs around the gutter as far as he could.
He was sure he looked ridiculous, a 4-year-old boy 3 stories up, wrapped around a metal gutter like an inexperienced fireman. 𝐀𝐻𝐬 knew that he had to let himself drop a little, but he really didn't want to. Taking a deep breath, he slowly released his grip and let himself slide downwards. He never fully let go, and the high-pitched sound of his skin rubbing against the metal made him wince, but he made it to the ground eventually. He stood up with trembling legs and pressed his palms against his shirt to try and ease the pain from the friction. 𝐀𝐻𝐬 ultimately decided to not worry about how he was going to get back up until he needed to and walked out of the parking lot and down the street. It was kind of scary now that he was out here. It was dark, and even though there weren't a lot of people walking around, there were still some. Most of them were people out at bars, so they were drunk and didn't really give him a second glance. They were good targets for pickpocketing. Choosing a random person off the street, he waited until they were alone to pretend to bump into him. The man's wallet was in his back pocket, so he quickly slipped his hand inside it and pulled it out. Betrayed by his nervous shaking hands, the wallet fell out of his hands and into the ground. The man turned around and his face morphed into a furious scowl. "Did you just try to steal my wallet?" 𝐀𝐻𝐬 was mature, yes, but in the face of an angry man who was much bigger than him, he couldn't stop the tears that he tried to force back. "No, sir," he lied. "I just bumped into you by accident." "That's bullshit." The man reached forward to grab him but was suddenly stopped by gray bandages wrapping around his arm. A figure clad in black jumped down from the roof and stood in between them. "What do you think you're doing?" 𝐲𝐻𝐬 was having a good day. The key word being was. It was still early on in his internship with His Purple Highness, and it was going perfectly fine. 𝐴𝐵RO and 𝐁𝐸 were making his life difficult, but he guessed it would be worse if they weren't there. Highness had taken them out for patrol for the night and allowed them to go on separate routes as training. 𝐲𝐻𝐬 purposefully chose a route that went through a busy part of the city, hoping that no one would be stupid enough to start a fight with so many people around. It was just his luck that as he was jumping over the roofs, he heard yelling. He quickly ran over to the side of the building and looked down. A man, probably around his mid-20s, was yelling at a little kid who was wide-eyed and clearly scared. 𝐲𝐻𝐬 rushed into action when the man surged forwards, intending on grabbing the kid. His capture weapon wrapped around his arm, and he stepped in between the two. "What do you think you're doing?" The man bared his teeth. "The brat was trying to steal from me." 𝐲𝐻𝐬 raised an eyebrow and looked from the wallet in his hands to his eyes. "Well, he obviously didn't succeed. I can take care of this from here." The man glanced at the kid again before scowling and drunkenly stumbling away. The kid looked up at him with wet eyes. Before mumbling, "Thanks," he scanned 𝐲𝐻𝐬 up and down and laughed through his tears. "We match." Sure enough, they were both wearing all black with a gray scarf. 𝐲𝐻𝐬 could feel his facade cracking as he looked at the adorable kid. He had to stay strong. He was a hero, damn it. He crouched down and set a hand on the kid's head. "Kid, how old are you?" Immediately, his expression closed off. "How old are you?" he shot back. 𝐲𝐻𝐬 answered easily. "I'm 18. I'm in my last year at UA. And right now I'm interning at a hero agency. That's why I was on patrol." He seemed a little shocked at the amount of information that he gave him but seemed to be a little more trusting. "I'm 𝐀𝐻𝐬," he finally muttered. 𝐲𝐻𝐬 noted the lack of a surname and continued to press. "How old are you, 𝐀𝐻𝐬?" Seeing no way to deflect the question, he reluctantly answered. "And 4. Sucking in a breath, 𝐲𝐻𝐬 could already feel himself aging with stress. What the hell was a 4-year-old doing out here all alone? 4, okay, he grumbled. "What are you doing out here?" "I needed to buy some cream." "What, cream?" he asked. "Burn cream." "Oh," 𝐲𝐻𝐬 sighed. "Why do you need burn cream, kid?" Without answering, he pulled back his scarf and the collar of his shirt, revealing what looked like a bad sunburn. It was red and peeling and overall looked very painful. 𝐲𝐻𝐬 felt like sighing again but held it back. "Where did you even get that?" No response. He let the sigh out. "Come with me." He waved 𝐀𝐻𝐬 over and they walked down the street together. As they walked, 𝐲𝐻 looked down at him and tried to hold back a small grin at the expression on his face. Gone were the tears, and in its place was eagerness. 𝗵𝘃𝐻 obviously wanted to ask him some questions. He schooled his face into something more impassive. "If you want to ask me something, go ahead. I can see it in your face," he said dryly. 𝗵𝘃𝐻's questions flowed out of his mouth. "How is your internship so far? Is it fun? What's your name? What's your quirk?" 𝐲𝐻 normally didn't like to talk about his life or himself, but 𝗵𝘃𝐻 was for, what harm could there be? He didn't want to be rude to a child. "First of all, my hero name is Eraserhead.
My quirk is called Erasure. I can erase quirks. He didn't expand on the limitations of his quirk. Even if 𝗵𝘃𝐻 was a child, there was no way he was telling someone his weaknesses. My internship has been fine, I guess. 2 of my classmates are with me, but they can be a handful. 𝗵𝘃𝐻 looked at him knowingly. "So they're your friends, but you just don't want to admit that you like them."
𝐲𝐻 stumbled and stared at the kid. He was right, but when did 4-year-olds get so sassy? "HN." 𝗵𝘃𝐻 laughed. "What are their names?" "Loud Cloud and Midnight," he told him. "They're both very loud and energetic. So, everything you're not." 𝐲𝐻 snorted. "You got that right, kid. Were 4-year-olds supposed to be this perceptive or literate?" The convenience store was finally in sight. 𝗵𝘃𝐻 sent him a questioning look, but he just ignored it. 𝐲𝐻 led him down the aisles to the medical supplies and stopped in front of the burn creams. He gestured to the shelves. "Pick one." The kid looked lost. "What do you mean? I don't have any money." 𝐲𝐻 pulled out a few notes and waved them. "I'm paying, kid." He expected 𝗵𝘃𝐻 to protest more, but he only gaped for a second before giving in and grabbing a bottle off the shelf. They checked out, and he added a few pieces of chocolate to the bill, just because. When they stepped back out into the night, 𝐲𝐻 handed him a piece, and 𝗵𝘃𝐻 took it with a slight smile. He was really starting to like this kid. He was quiet, smart, but also passionate, and he dressed like him. "Will you let me walk you home?" 𝗵𝘃𝐻 jumped at the sudden voice but quickly calmed down. He was looking away from 𝐲𝐻 nervously. "I think it's probably better if you don't." 𝐲𝐻 was worried, but he knew when to stop pushing. Letting a 4-year-old walk home was irresponsible, so he was still going to follow him. He just had to make sure that 𝗵𝘃𝐻 didn't see him. "All right," he conceded. "Take the rest of the chocolate, though. Loud Cloud will eat it all if I bring it back with me." 𝗵𝘃𝐻 accepted the handful of chocolate and stuffed it into his pockets. "Thank you, Eraserhead, for all of this." 𝐲𝐻 ruffled his hair, then froze, surprised by his own actions. "No problem, kid," he managed to get out. On that note, he jumped onto the roof of a nearby building and backed into the shadows, and 𝗵𝘃𝐻 started his walk home. Everything was normal for a while. 𝗵𝘃𝐻 would occasionally pull out a piece of chocolate and eat it while reading the information on the bottle of burn cream. Eventually, he started jogging. They were going uphill, and 𝐲𝐻 was surprised at how much stamina he had. He would have thought a 4-year-old would be tired by now. Suddenly, 𝗵𝘃𝐻 darted down an alley. Startled, 𝐲𝐻 paused for a second before running after him. He was just in time to see him dart around the corner, and he used his capture weapon to swing down and skid around the corner, expecting to see 𝗵𝘃𝐻. He was understandably stunned when no one was there. Footsteps pounded behind him, and 𝐲𝐻 whipped around with his capture weapon at the ready. Light blue hair and tan skin entered his vision, and he relaxed. "𝗲𝗲𝐻," he sighed, "don't do that." 𝗲𝗲𝐻 only cackled, throwing an arm over 𝐲𝐻's shoulders. "I saw that whole thing. How did you not catch him?" 𝐲𝐻 scowled. "Oh, so you saw where he went?" The silence was all the answer he needed. "Anyways," 𝗲𝗲𝐻 clapped, "Highness wants us to meet back at the agency. He already collected Midnight. Lead the way," he sighed. 𝐲𝐻 seemed to be doing that a lot recently. Later, when 𝗵𝘃𝐻 got back inside his room, the first thing he did was grab the notebook from under the mattress and write down everything he knew about Eraserhead, along with any questions he had. What would happen if he used his quirk on him? Would 𝗵𝘃𝐻 cease to exist? Would he be trapped in a limbo of sorts? It was frightening, but also very interesting. Based on his clothes, and just his general mannerisms and moves, 𝗵𝘃𝐻 assumed that Eraserhead was training to become an underground hero. After some more research, he had to admit that it sounded appealing. Being in the limelight was fine, but there was something so much better about helping from the shadows, and not in front of cameras. For some reason, he felt like it made the underground heroes more genuine. They weren't becoming heroes to get famous, they were becoming heroes to help. They didn't care if they got fame out of it or not. 𝗵𝘃𝐻 desperately wanted to help. Because of that, Eraserhead became his new favorite hero, even if he wasn't completely licensed. The burn cream helped a lot, and he left it in a small box in the corner of the bedroom, tucked between the bookshelf and the wall. As he drifted to sleep, he promised himself and 𝐸𝐸 that he would be successful in his attempts to pickpocket next time so he could get 𝐸𝐸 more supplies. A couple of days later, 𝗵𝘃𝐻 stared in horror at the article he was reading. Horrific villain attack causes building to collapse, killing you a third-year hero course student. 𝗲𝐻 𝐍𝐴 𝐬 𝐈𝐬 Loud Cloud. Eraser. Over the next few years, things stayed consistent. He never saw Eraserhead again. But every week 𝐀𝐦 would sneak out and pickpocket people so he could pay for the small gifts that he bought for Izuku. Sometimes it went well, and other times it didn't. One time, he spotted a tall man wearing baggy pants and saw the outline of his wallet in his back pocket. It was perfect. If he stayed quiet, he would be able to slip his hand inside without him feeling it. 𝐀𝐦 made his way towards him carefully, looking to make sure that no one could see. The man seemed to be unaware of his presence, and he took a deep breath before reaching into the man's pocket quickly and removing his wallet. For a moment, 𝐀𝐦 thought he was successful. He was feeling victorious, but he didn't account for the man having literal eyes on the back of his head. He ended up running 3 blocks before the man got tired and gave up. Over those few years, he had accumulated a good amount of medical supplies, and he hid them in the box next to the bookshelf. There were bandages, gauze, different kinds of creams, rubbing alcohol, and even a small sewing kit for stitches. Izuku and 𝐀𝐦 were 10 now. 𝐀𝐦 was finally introduced to Bakugo back when they were 7, and he hated him. He was the person who kept bullying Izuku. And whenever 𝐀𝐦 was in control when it was time for school, he tried his hardest to make Bakugo's life difficult for him. Of course, he never knew it was 𝐀𝐦, but it was still entertaining to watch. He would steal his homework and watch him panic, and would only give it back once the teacher was about to collect it. It helped his pickpocketing skills, too. In that respect, he was getting very good. He barely got caught. It was the little things that made Bakugo mad. Of course, he couldn't let things get too bad. He didn't want to get caught, but he decided to keep it up just enough to keep him in a bad mood for a while. Other things he did that slightly inconvenienced Bakugo's life consisted of changing his locker code whenever he could, stealing the ink and all the graphite from his pens and pencils, and bending one of the metal legs of his chair so that it was never even and rocked whenever he moved. 𝐀𝐦 only ever stayed up long enough to go to school about once a month, so he took great joy in watching Bakugo become annoyed by the things he did. Izuku had a diary in which he wrote down almost everything, and it wasn't in a very good hiding place, so 𝐀𝐦 found it easily. He would read it every couple of days so he could stay up to date and knowledgeable about the things that were happening. Sure, it could be pegged as an invasion of privacy, and 𝐀𝐦 did feel slightly guilty, but it was his body too. He wanted to know what Bakugo was doing, and he used it to track what Izuku needed. He felt proud when he read that Izuku was grateful for the medical supplies. At first, Izuku had suspected that his mom had found out about Bakugo, but after some well-placed hints garnered no reaction, he gave that up. Thankfully, he still didn't know where they were coming from, but he was thankful all the same. As long as nothing dangerous or hurtful popped up, Izuku was willing to ignore it. Speaking of the burn cream, 𝐀𝐦 noticed that they were running low, so he decided to go out that night to get more. Every time that he bought more supplies, he went to a different store. If the people there saw a young kid constantly buying first aid supplies, they were bound to get suspicious. Today, he picked a small pharmacy in the town next to his and excitedly slid down the gutter. After sneaking out for so long, he had gotten over his fear of dropping down the side of the building, and walking so far to other stores wasn't a problem for him.
The amount of walking he did at night helped to slowly raise his stamina to great levels. He could run for almost an hour straight, and walking for a few was practically nothing. Along with his physical training, he also took free online classes on the days he didn't go out. Most of his classes were math-based, like calculus and physics. He didn't really bother with classes like literature and history. They just weren't things that he thought were important. 𝐀𝐦 could already read, and he knew an impressive amount of kanji, and history just wasn't useful in his opinion. For some reason, he also took a liking to dancing. With his enhanced physical abilities, he was able to move gracefully, and he took pride in his dancing abilities even if he had no one to brag to.
One thing led to another, and he found fighting through dancing. Karate, boxing, kickboxing, judo, jiu-jitsu, taekwondo, and even wrestling. He loved it even more than dancing, and quickly looked up videos on how to start practicing. Learning through videos was a little hard, but 𝐀𝐦 sort of got the hang of it. He would never be as good as he would be if he had a teacher, but there was no way he was going to be able to get one. Honestly, he was surprised 𝐀𝐦 hadn't caught him staying up late by now. It had been 6 years. Throughout those 5 years, though, 𝐀𝐦 could count the number of times he had a conversation with 𝐀𝐦 on 2 hands. She was a lovely woman, but he didn't know her all that well. Soon enough, the pharmacy came into view and he walked inside. Even after all these years, he still kept dressing like Eraserhead when he went out. It was a habit and one that 𝐀𝐦 didn't really want to break. He had a system worked out, and it seemed to be working very well for him. He felt confident that he could keep this up for a little while longer. Walking into the store, he made a beeline for the medical section but froze when he saw someone was already there. The man had black hair, and 𝐀𝐦 could tell it was dyed by the leftover stains on his face. He had severe, purplish burns that covered his face and neck and had only staples to hold them together. Piercings dotted his face, and despite his injuries, he was rather good-looking. You should rinse out the hair dye upside down. It won't stain you much if you do, 𝐀𝐻𝐬 offered. The man looked down at him with uninterested eyes. Thanks, he drawled sarcastically. I'd do that if I had an actual shower. Are you homeless? He sighed tiredly. I don't see why it's any of your business, but yes. 𝐀𝐻𝐬 looked at him. That must suck. How long? What is this, an interview? 𝐀𝐻𝐬 paused and thought for a moment. He was smarter than this. The man was probably a criminal and he was thinking of inviting him to his house. The weird thing was, he didn't get a bad feeling about the man. He obviously had been through something traumatic. But he was young, probably around 18. Don't do it. You can use my house, you idiot. He developed a sort of sixth sense about these kinds of things, courtesy of his pickpocketing adventures. Most of the time, his hunches turned out correct, so he was willing to see where this went. And 𝐀𝐻𝐬 did have a bleeding heart, though, so maybe she would be willing to take him in, but it was better not to jinx it. A plan formed in his mind. The man raised an eyebrow. Really? You don't even know me, kid? What, you're like 7? 𝐀𝐻𝐬 frowned. I'm 10, asshole. A 10-year-old who swears. Amazing. He huffed. What's your name, anyway? The man hesitated but answered anyway. It's 𝗬𝗲𝗿. You don't sound so sure about that. 𝐀𝐻𝐬 raised an eyebrow. 𝗬𝗲𝗿 grumbled and deflected the conversation away from him. What's yours, brat? I'm 𝐀𝐻𝐬. He paused. Sort of. 𝗬𝗿 looked at him incredulously. What do you mean, sort of? 𝐀𝐻𝐬 waved off his question. I'll tell you if you decide to come with me. It's something you need to know. Anyways, why are you standing around the aisle like a lost puppy? A lost 𝗬𝗿 cut himself off, grumbling. I wanted to buy some burn cream, but I don't have enough money, so I was thinking of throwing myself off the closest bridge. Grabbing his stack of bills, 𝐀𝐻𝐬 pulled it out with a grin. PSH, don't even worry about it. I'll pay. 𝗬𝗿 gaped. Where did a 10-year-old get that much money? Where did you get that? He asked. He handed 𝗬𝗿 half of the stack. Not legally, but I get the feeling that you don't care. Shaking his head, he accepted the cash. Not even a little bit, kid. If you come back with me, you won't need to worry about money anymore. 𝐀𝐻𝐬 pushed. He liked 𝗬𝗿. He was funny and definitely not trying to kill him. Honestly, he just felt like a kid that had a hard life. Sure, maybe he's done some illegal things, but so had 𝐀𝐻𝐬. 𝗬𝗿 stared at him. You sound like you're trying to kidnap me. I feel like the roles should be reversed. 𝐀𝐻𝐬 tried to force a smile down. Are you trying to kidnap me? What? 𝗬𝗿 sputtered, caught off guard. No, that's something a kidnapper would say. I'm not kidnapping you. 𝐀𝐻𝐬 burst out laughing, and 𝗬𝗿 tried and failed to hide a smile. He sighed. Okay, fine, I'll go with you. Where do you live? Who lives with you? I live with my guardian, 𝐴𝐻𝐬, in the town over. We only have 2 bedrooms, but it won't be a problem. I'm sure she'll let you crash on our couch until you find a stable job. While they talked, they walked around the store and picked out random things that they wanted. Some ice cream, medical supplies, candy, 2 giant bottles of Gatorade, chips, and lotion. After they paid and walked out, 𝗬𝗿 asked, how are you even going to convince her to let me live with you?
𝐀𝐻𝐬 sighed. Let me tell you about my quirk. Shit, 𝗬𝗿 mumbled as he stared blankly ahead. So, you're a quirk, and 𝐬𝐡𝐻𝐬 is the actual name of this body. And the kid who manifested you. 𝐀𝐻𝐬 scuffed his shoe on the sidewalk. Yeah, I know it's weird. I'm a quirk. I'm not even a real person.
𝗬𝗿 stopped in his tracks. What? Of course you are. You're completely sentient. That's like saying the principal of UA is unfit for his job just because he's an animal. Appalled, 𝐀𝐻𝐬 scowled. That's bullshit. Of course he is. It doesn't matter that he's an animal. Principal 𝐁𝐬 is super smart. He should have the same rights and abilities as people. He's a sentient being, not an... Oh, 𝗬𝗿 snorted. See, it doesn't matter that you're a quirk. You have the same rights and abilities as people. You're sentient, and from what I'm seeing right now, completely real. 𝐀𝐻𝐬 was silent. He'd never had anyone to talk to about this, and he spent the last 6 years coming to terms with the fact that he wasn't real, and 𝗬𝗿 tore it all down over the span of 5 minutes. It was shocking to have his own words thrown back in his face, and they hit him like a wall. 𝗬𝗿 was right. He could talk, he could learn, and he had feelings and thoughts. He was his own being, just like anyone else. The more he thought about it, the more it made sense. 𝗬𝗿, don't mention it. Seriously, don't. The smirk on his face gave away his real feelings, and he draped an arm over 𝐀𝐻𝐬's shoulder. What's the plan, kid? He took a deep breath and told him. It'll have to wait until tomorrow, probably until I get out of school. I'm going to stay awake so I can actually go to school. And when we let out, I'll meet you somewhere, maybe a park. 𝐴𝐻𝐬 lets me walk home from school alone now, so we don't have to worry about her getting worried. We can fake a villain attack, or tell her I got mugged. And you can carry me back home and pretend as if you saved me. If you tell her I passed out, it would give us an alibi as to why 𝐬𝐻𝐬 won't remember what happened. 𝐴𝐻𝐬 will most likely invite you in. And if you play up the homeless teenager act, you'll have her wrapped around your finger in no time. 𝗬𝗿 hummed. That's pretty good. Should I be worried you know how to manipulate your poor, sweet mother? First, she's Izuku's mom, and no, this'll probably be the only time I do this. She's too nice. Nice enough to not throw me out at a first glance. Absolutely. During the walk back home, 𝐴𝐻𝐻 found out that 𝗬𝗲𝐻 had a fire quirk. He made blue flames, and they were so pretty. He asked him if he could light candles with his quirk because blue flames on candles would make for a fantastic atmosphere. But he said he couldn't. The fire burned too hot, and if it was lit for a while it could shatter the glass. It would work for candles that weren't encased in glass, and 𝐴𝐻𝐻 decided that he would buy some the next time he went out. That's a shame, it would have been cool. He had seen blue fire before, it was nothing like 𝗬𝗲𝐻's. It was the most beautiful blue flame he had ever seen. And with the way it danced around 𝗬𝗲𝐻's body, he could almost feel a sort of humming in the space around him, as if it was alive. 𝗬𝗲𝐻 asked him about his quirk, too. He told him about the physical and mental enhancements, and the fact that he was trying to learn how to fight, but failing. He perked up a little at that. I could teach you, he said. 𝐴𝐻𝐻 looked at 𝗬𝗲𝐻 with a very curious look. You could. I don't want to trouble you. 𝗬𝗲𝐻 pushed him teasingly and smirked. Don't worry about it, kid, it's the least I can do. I actually have lots of professional training. Though the word training isn't really what it was. Unaware of the tension, he asked, if it wasn't training, what was it? It was training, I guess, but it got so harsh to the point where it was abuse. Immediately cringing, 𝐴𝐻𝐻 apologized. 𝗬𝗲𝐻 just waved him off, though the tension in his frame was still present. So, do you want me to train you? I've always wanted to train, especially with somebody who could teach me. His eyes were shining with excitement and anticipation. If you're willing, I'd love to accept. With their deal made, they went their separate ways with the promise to meet at the park after he got out of school. Staying awake was a real challenge for 𝐴𝐻𝐻. He was overrun with guilt about the fact that Izuku wasn't going to remember the entire school day, so he promised to take as many notes as he could. Currently, he was on the computer looking at free physics classes and stayed up all night taking notes on all of the different types of things he had learned, how to solve different physics equations, and the process, and even tried doing the equations himself on his computer. This is actually quite interesting, he found himself mumbling. He was looking at the different schools that had the best physics program, and unsurprisingly, 𝐬𝐻 was at the top. He wondered just how much he would learn at a place like 𝐬𝐻, but he knew he would never be able to go. Even if Izuku ended up getting accepted into 𝐬𝐻, 𝐴𝐻𝐻 wouldn't be able to attend classes, considering he was always awake at night. Also, Izuku still didn't know he existed. He didn't know when he was going to tell Izuku about himself. Maybe in a few more years. 𝐴𝐻𝐻 had already given himself a headache from the amount of math he had studied, and his mind felt like mush. The work, along with his lack of sleep, was beginning to make his eyes feel heavy. My mind is going to explode. 𝐴𝐻𝐻 was beginning to doze off but jerked back up when his head fell forwards. He was determined to stay awake, even though it was getting harder and harder for him. He was struggling, trying to keep his mind focused and his consciousness up, but the exhaustion was getting the best of him. All that 𝐴𝐻𝐻 wanted to do was sleep and rest, but he knew he had to stay awake. He needed to stay awake, or else the plan wouldn't work. 𝗬𝗲𝐻 needed a place to stay, and 𝐴𝐻𝐻 didn't want to fall asleep and have Izuku take over, because then 𝗬𝗲𝐻 would be waiting for someone who would never come, and he couldn't do that to him. It was funny, and 𝐴𝐻𝐻 genuinely wanted to help him. The prospect of actually having a friend was so overwhelming for him because he had never had one before. It had been 6 years, and throughout the whole time, he was alone. If he didn't leave to pickpocket people or occasionally go to school, the only person he would interact with was 𝐴𝐻𝐻. He had never really had a friend he could talk to, and the fact that 𝗬𝗲𝐻 was willing to listen to him and be there for him was so amazing to 𝐴𝐻𝐻 that he didn't know how to act. Soon enough it was morning, and he was pretending to sleep in his bed when 𝐻𝐻 came to wake him up. Before he left for school, he asked her if he could have some gum. For my breath, was what he said. It was a lie, but she didn't need to know that. The tradition of annoying 𝗵𝘃𝐻 until he got in trouble had to continue, of course. By the time he got to the classroom, it was still a little early, so neither 𝗵𝘃𝐻 nor the teacher were there yet. 𝐴𝐻𝐻 mentally celebrated and nonchalantly walked by his seat, all while discreetly sticking the gum to it. He decided to practice some of the physics equations that he had learned during the night, and he began to do some calculations. He worked away at his notebook, until all of a sudden he heard the classroom door slam open and the sound of 𝗵𝘃𝐻 talking. 𝐴𝐻𝐻 looked up at 𝗵𝘃𝐻, and as usual, he was being followed by his 2 lackeys. Eventually, he sat down, and to 𝐴𝐻𝐻's shock, didn't even notice the gum that he was currently sitting on. Throughout the class, he would occasionally have to hold a hand over his mouth to muffle his laughs whenever 𝗵𝘃𝐻 would shift and he could see the gum stuck to his pants. It was immature, but he had to get his entertainment from somewhere. These classes were way too easy for him, and he needed to not fall asleep. 𝗵𝘃𝐻 asked to use the bathroom, and as he walked out of the room, all of the kids started to snicker. The bright pink gum completely contrasted his black pants, which made it easier to see. The funny thing was, no one told him, not even his lackeys. Mikumo, for one, was more than happy to not tell Bakugo because he knew that he deserved it. A few minutes later, the entire class jumped as a yell echoed down the hall from the bathroom. It was Bakugo, yelling with extreme profanity about the gum stuck to his pants. The teacher sighed at his language and walked out to talk to him while the class erupted into laughter. This is the best thing I've ever done. After school, Mikumo walked to the playground down the road and settled down to wait for 𝗵𝗲𝗍. He was tapping his feet, a little nervous. Would everything go to plan? Would 𝐴𝐻𝐻 agree? Would she even believe them? Someone set a hand on his shoulder, and he flinched and whipped around. It was 𝗵𝗲𝗍, and he raised his hands in defense. My bad, kid. Mikumo sighed and smiled tiredly. It's not your fault, 𝗵𝗲𝗍. I've been jumpy and tired all day. I really need sleep. 𝗵𝗲𝗍 waved him up. Let's go, then. As they walked, Mikumo told 𝗵𝗲𝗍 what he should expect when he finally falls asleep. Izuku is apparently very hyper but also shy. He's a total nerd for heroes and quirks, so don't be surprised if he asks you about yours. He'll probably gush over it and ask you to use it. From the impression I've gotten from 𝐴𝐻𝐻, he's very sweet and kind. Obviously, I've never met him, but I'm pretty confident in my assumptions. He walked beside 𝗵𝗲𝗍, feeling the exhaustion finally catch up to him. You'll have to excuse me. I feel I'm going to fall asleep on my feet. He rubbed his eyes, trying to fight against the overwhelming feeling of sleepiness that he was feeling at the moment. His body was shutting down, and his senses were slowing. 𝗵𝗲𝗍 flicked his head and he jolted up. Don't fall asleep now, we can't have you switching. I know, I'm just so tired. Well, suck it up. Mikumo scowled without any heat and decided to count the cracks on the pavement to try and stay awake until they got closer to his house. It only worked a little, and 𝗵𝗲𝗍 had to continually flick him so he didn't collapse on the ground. Finally, after what felt like forever, the apartment building was in sight. I live on the 3rd floor, so you'll have to carry me up the stairs. 𝗵𝗲𝗍 grimaced. I'm in shape, but not that in shape. There has to be another way. Nope. Sorry, he apologized, not sounding sorry at all. The elevator is broken, so you'll have to take the stairs. 𝗵𝗲𝗍 groaned loudly and bent down so Mikumo could get on his back. He climbed on and listened gleefully as 𝗵𝗲𝗍 huffed and complained under his breath the whole way. They reached his apartment door, and he could feel 𝗵𝗲𝗍 tense under him. It'll be fine, he told him. There's no way she'll turn you away. I'll believe it when I see it. Bracing himself, he knocked on the door and waited nervously for 𝐻𝐻𝐻 to answer. The sound of a lock unlatching met their ears, and the door opened to reveal the worried face of 𝐻𝐻𝐻. She looked at 𝗵𝗲𝗍 in confusion before her eyes were drawn to Mikumo, who was pretending to sleep, and it quickly changed to shock. Oh, my Izuku. What happened? She turned to 𝗵𝗲𝗍. He looked down at the floor and shuffled a little. I was walking down the street and I saw that a man had followed him around the corner. I saw him trying to mug your son, but I managed to scare him away. His head got hit on the wall, though, so he might be a bit disoriented when he wakes up. I asked him where he lived before he passed out so I could bring him home. 𝐻𝐻𝐻 covered her mouth in horror and hurriedly rushed him in. Come in, come in. If you could just lay him down on the couch, please. Mikumo let himself fall limp, just to give 𝗵𝗲𝗍 more trouble. He noticed, based on the flick he gave him. Would you like some tea? 𝐻𝐻𝐻 asked. He went to refuse, before remembering that he was trying to get her on his side, and accepted with a quiet, that would be nice. She smiled. Of course, dear. You can sit at the table if you'd like. 𝗵𝗲𝗍 noted that she never commented or flinched at his appearance, not even once. He was extremely grateful. A few minutes later, the tea was done and the two of them sat across from each other, slowly sipping the hot liquid. 𝗵𝗲𝗍 didn't know what to say, but luckily 𝐻𝐻𝐻 was able to keep the conversation going. Thank you for saving my son, she said sincerely. I don't know what I would do if anything happened to him. I'm 𝐻𝐻𝐻 Midoriya, and my son is Izuku. 𝗵𝗲𝗍 nodded. It was no problem, Midoriya. Really? 𝐻𝐻𝐻 snorted and waved her hand dismissively. Oh, none of that. Call me 𝐻𝐻𝐻. He smiled a little into the mug. You got it, 𝐻𝐻𝐻. I'm 𝗵𝗲𝗍, by the way. She smiled. It's a pleasure to meet you. How old are you? 𝗵𝗲𝗍 wrapped his hands around the mug, letting the warmth seep into his fingers. I'm 18, almost 19. Oh, you're very young. Shouldn't you be at school? 𝐻𝐻𝐻 asked, confused and a little concerned. He glanced away, a little uncomfortable. It didn't work out. I'm trying to find a job, but it's been hard because of, well, you know. The gesture to his general appearance. She hummed and looked to the side, thinking hard. What education do you have? I never finished middle school. 𝐻𝐻𝐻 nodded, but he could see the worry in her eyes. That's all right. You're in luck, though. I work with a woman whose daughter owns a small cafe, and she's looking for some extra help. Their whole family has mutant-type quirks, so the cafe is marketed as a safe space for other people with mutant-type quirks or different appearances in general. His eyes widened in shock, and he couldn't help but feel a little touched. Oh, she exclaimed. I just remembered. They gave me a little pamphlet for it. Let me go look for it. I'll be right back. 𝐀𝐦 stood up and walked back down the hall into her room. After she left, 𝗵𝗲 let out a heavy sigh. This is weirder than I thought it would be, he remarked, looking at 𝐀𝐦 lying on the couch. He grunted something unintelligible and kept his eyes closed. What's that? 𝗵𝗲 raised an eyebrow, tilting his head as if trying to hear what he had said. Nothing, 𝐀𝐦 whispered. He shrugged and continued sipping his tea. This situation is awkward for you, isn't it? A little, he said. I haven't been around someone so nice in a while. What did I say? I told you she was amazing. 𝗵𝗲 snorted and tapped his fingers on the table. Do you think they'd actually hire me? 𝐀𝐦 shifted a little so he could see him. I don't see why not. Making coffee doesn't require math or science. It helps that the place is non-discriminatory. Yeah, you're probably right. 𝗵𝗲 was silent for a moment. But even if I get the job, then what? I mean, I'm still homeless and I'll need a place to live. I already told you that you could live here. 𝐀𝐦 will probably offer to, 𝐀𝐦 reasoned, and then you'll have an income. And you could eventually afford to rent an apartment. That's still progress, right? I guess, but it's pretty slow progress, 𝗵𝗲 replied. I wish I could just jump straight to the part where I'm in a place of my own, you know. Footsteps echoed down the hall and 𝐀𝐦 shut his eyes, pretending to sleep while 𝗵𝗲 turned his attention back to the woman entering the room. 𝐀𝐦 came back, smiling brightly. I found it, and it's only a few minutes down the road. He reached forward and picked up the pamphlet, taking a look at the address. It wasn't far, just on the other side of town. And the pictures inside made it look like a cute place. I hope it isn't too far from your place, is it? 𝗵𝗲 froze. No, it'll be fine. She obviously didn't believe him, and she crossed her arms and stared at him intently. Young man, where are you living? Here and there, you know. He was becoming increasingly nervous. How did such a look come from such a tiny woman? 𝐀𝐦 caught his gaze and didn't look away. I think I do know. Tell me you're not homeless. 𝗵𝗲 stayed quiet. She sighed and looked back at him with decisiveness and determination. Well, I guess you'll just have to lie. A yawn and a mumble cut her off, and the two of them looked over to see Izuku stretching as if he had just woken up from a long nap. He rubbed his eyes and looked at 𝐀𝐦, before seeing 𝗵𝗲 and freezing. Who are you? 𝐀𝐦 immediately jumped up and ran over to him, fussing and asking him how he felt. Oh, 𝗵𝗲 thought. He must have fallen asleep. He chuckled to himself and took a sip of his tea, watching as 𝐀𝐦 worriedly hovered over Izuku. She was like a mother hen with her chicks. Izuku was blushing and trying desperately to reassure his mom that he was okay. It was almost a complete 180 from 𝐀𝐦's attitude and personality. 𝐀𝐦, similar to 𝗵𝗲, was a reserved and standoffish person. He's sarcastic and cynical, and is often closed off and distrustful, but has a sense of loyalty and pride to him. He can also be very direct and harsh with his words, and it takes a lot to earn his trust and respect. He is also incredibly intelligent and perceptive and can be quite cunning when he wants to be. Izuku, on the other hand, is more kind and optimistic. He is also an empathetic and understanding person and is always trying to see the best in people. He's always ready to help and truly has a heroic spirit. Yes, he's shy, but he has an endless determination that fuels him. The differences in their personalities were like night and day. If Izuku was the sun, 𝐀𝐦 was the moon. They complemented one another perfectly. Maybe it was just her personality, but 𝗵𝗲 wished he had an 𝐀𝐦 in his life. Someone kind and gentle, like her. Someone who could treat him fondly like she treated Izuku. He shook his head to dispel the thoughts. He had more important things to worry about. His job and his future were what he needed to focus on. Izuku, this is 𝗵𝗲. He saved you from a villain earlier, do you remember? He said you hit your head. Izuku looked at him, but no expression of recognition followed. He shook his head slowly. No, I don't. Izuku had learned long ago not to tell his mom about his memory lapses. The first time he told her, she freaked out so badly that she almost forced him to go to the hospital. Nowadays, he never mentioned it, except for this time. It had a reasonable explanation, so he figured it would be fine. As always, it wasn't. 𝐀𝐦 gasped and covered her mouth with her hands. We should take you to the hospital, honey. This isn't the first time you've forgotten something and I'm getting worried. No, Mom, I'm fine. I don't need to go, I promise. It also won't help that the nurses will see the bruises and burns. Besides, I want to talk to 𝗵𝗲. The man in question froze. What you do? Izuku grinned, redness dusting his face. Yeah, are you a hero? What's your quirk? I bet it's so cool. I can't believe you saved me, that's amazing. 𝗵𝗲 looked overwhelmed and 𝐀𝐦 smiled fondly. I'll go make some dinner while you two talk. Izuku nodded and excitedly turned to the man with an even wider grin. He was basically trembling with anticipation as he waited for 𝗵𝗲 to speak. It was odd to see him acting like this when 𝗵𝗲 had met 𝐀𝐦 first, but it was a little adorable. He was almost like a little brother. He was Shoto's age. All right, kid. Settle down, I'll tell you about my quirk. 𝗵𝗲 sat on the floor in front of the couch and leaned up against the coffee table, smirking at the little, yes, Izuku whisper shouted. You sure get excited, don't you? 𝗵𝗲 resisted the urge to ruffle the boy's hair. First, I'm not a hero. And my quirk is blue flame. I can create and shoot blue flames out of my body, which can make me pretty versatile in battle. After hesitating for a moment, he continued, they get really hot, and my mom had an ice quirk, and my dad a fire quirk. I got my dad's fire, but my mom's resistance to fire. 𝐬𝐻𝐸 zoned out and started to mumble. I've heard that blue flames are considered to be hotter than traditional flames, so I would guess that your quirk would be much more dangerous because of that fact. With your flames burning hotter than a normal fire, you would be able to inflict more damage on your opponents in combat situations because your flames would be much more difficult to put out. You could probably burn through solid objects, but without the resistance to the fire, it would hurt you. That's probably how you got your burns. His words started to become unintelligible, and 𝗵𝗲 was shocked into silence at his analysis of his quirk. He was correct about everything, even about him burning through solid objects. It had happened on that day, and although he never saw the aftermath, he certainly heard about it. The room was melted and destroyed beyond all recognition. Realizing what he had said, 𝐬𝐻𝐸 quickly shut his mouth and flushed. I'm so sorry. That was so insensitive. Really, I didn't mean to do anything like that, 𝗵𝗲 scoffed but smirked to show he was kidding. It's fine, kid. You were right, anyways. I overused my quirk when I was a kid and this happened. 𝐬𝐻𝐸 cocked his head. What did you do? Instantly, 𝗵𝗲 grimaced but smoothed his face over as quickly as he could. Maybe another day. Anyways, you really know your stuff. Where did you learn all that? Oh, it's just a hobby, really, he said shyly, ducking his head. I have a bunch of notebooks filled with quirk analysis about different heroes, but I'm not that good at it. 𝗵𝗲 blinked. What do you mean not that good? Kid, you're amazing at it. He looked at 𝐬𝐻𝐸 in disbelief. You analyze the quirks of heroes, just as a hobby. That's crazy. You must have a really sharp mind if you can remember all of that stuff, he said, impressed and dumbfounded all at once. 𝐬𝐻𝐸 turned redder than he even knew was possible, babbling in embarrassment at the praise. 𝗵𝗲 didn't give praise, advice, or basically any positive reinforcement ever. It was a habit he learned on the streets, and now he was accustomed to watching and judging quietly from the sidelines. He was way out of his depth, but 𝐬𝐻𝐸 had such an amazing talent and he needed him to understand it. Besides, he was 10 years old. 𝗵𝗲 didn't want to be mean to a child. He was 𝗧𝗱's age. 𝗵𝗲 couldn't help but think that he would have liked 𝐬𝐻𝐸. Once 𝐬𝐻𝐸 had recovered from his embarrassment, he quietly whispered, I've always wanted to be a hero, but now I don't think I'll ever be able to. 𝐬𝐻𝐸, he said firmly, it doesn't matter what other people say. If you want to be a hero, go be one. I wish I had that advice at your age. If I did, maybe I wouldn't be here, in this condition. I wish I had someone that told me to be whatever and whoever I wanted to be, and to not listen to what other people told me. I didn't have that, so I'm going to make sure you do. Other people don't have a say in your life, because it's your life. Personally, I think you'd make an amazing hero, even if I don't like them all that much. Maybe you can change my mind. 𝐬𝐻𝐸 smiled sadly, and tears beaded in his eyes. But, I'm quirkless. 𝗵𝗲 gave in and reached out to put a hand on his head. As I said before, it doesn't matter if you want to be a hero, then be one. 𝐬𝐻𝐸's head shot up and he looked at him with reluctant hope. He would have to be pretty determined to become one, and it would be a long and hard road. But you seem like the type of person who could do it, 𝗵𝗲 admitted. Quirks aren't everything. If you have the heart of a hero, then you'll make it, quirk or not. He knew that 𝐬𝐻𝐸 had a quirk, but it didn't make a difference. With him and Mikumo working together, they would make an amazing hero. Even if 𝐬𝐻𝐸 never found out about his guest, 𝗵𝗲 was sure that he could still make it. Between his intelligence, determination, and spirit, he had no doubt. He wasn't the type of person who shared his feeling or had deep emotional conversations. So when 𝐬𝐻𝐸 leaned into his chest and started sobbing, he knew he had reached his limit for today. He awkwardly patted his back and sent a desperate look over his shoulder. 𝐴𝐻𝐸 was standing there with a bright smile on her face. It was the happiest 𝗵𝗲 had seen her be since he had been there, and she mouthed a thank you to him. He nodded and she held his gaze for a few more seconds before walking back into the kitchen and calling out, Dinner's ready. Come eat. 𝐬𝐻𝐸 sat up, wiped his eyes, and collected himself. He shot 𝗵𝗲 a shy smile and grabbed his wrist to pull him into the kitchen. Mom made katsudon. It's the best. You'll love it. 𝐴𝐻𝐸 stopped him, and she looked at him seriously. I was going to ask before, but we were interrupted. Honey, if you need somewhere to stay, I'd be glad to set up the couch and let you stay here until you can support yourself. 𝐬𝐻𝐸 clearly loves you, and I wouldn't mind having someone here to keep an eye on him for a little while. 𝗵𝗲 floundered at the fond way she called him honey, and was so surprised that he didn't even want to decline her offer. He wanted to stay here with them. He had never felt so cared for and welcomed into someone's home before, especially after all the times he had been beaten down and yelled at. He gave 𝐴𝐻𝐸 a small genuine smile and a nod. I think I'd like that, he whispered. After 𝐴𝐻𝐸 and 𝐬𝐻𝐸 went to bed, and Mikumo woke up. He snuck out into the living room to bother 𝗑𝐻𝐻𝐻, who was sleeping on their couch for the time being. He jumped upright, startled by the unexpected visitor. Mikumo's sudden appearance caught 𝗑𝐻𝐻𝐻 off guard, and he instinctively covered his hand with flames before extinguishing them when he saw who it was. He rubbed at his eyes in annoyance. "What are you doing here, and why are you awake?" 𝗑𝐻𝐻𝐻 mumbled, struggling to push out the words. He didn't like to be woken up so suddenly, especially when he didn't know who did it. He felt a little guilty for his irritation but couldn't make himself feel differently. "Did you forget that whenever Izuku sleeps, I wake up?" Mikumo teased. "And I'm here 'cause you said you'd teach me how to fight." 𝗑𝐻𝐻𝐻 groaned. "I didn't know you wanted to do it tonight. I figured you would want to wait a few days so 𝑘𝐻 doesn't get suspicious." Mikumo frowned. "What if I said please?" 𝗑𝐻𝐻𝐻 looked down at him and felt a pang of guilt at the sad expression on his face. "Whatever, it doesn't matter," he shrugged, feigning nonchalance, and sat up, letting his feet hit the floor with a heavy impact. He yawned and stretched his arms, staring at Mikumo. "Are you ready, then? Let's get going." 𝗑𝐻𝐻𝐻 drawled as he stood up and brushed away any fatigue he felt. "Just make sure you can keep up." "The better question is if you can keep up with me," Mikumo smirked. "Don't get ahead of yourself, kid. I'm 8 years older. I think I can beat a shrimp like you." "As if I could wipe the floor with you, old man," he hissed. He gave 𝗑𝐻𝐻𝐻 a sharp glare, but it wasn't serious. "We'll see about that, kid. When we finish fighting, I'm gonna teach you how to throw a basic punch. Then, if you want, I can show you some of my more advanced techniques, assuming you can keep up," 𝗑𝐻𝐻 said with a feral grin. "Fine by me," Mikumo muttered. He wasn't about to back down from a challenge. They walked to his room, and 𝗑𝐻𝐻 snorted at all the All Might merch that covered the walls. "It's not even mine. It's Izuku's. He's not even my favorite hero," he snorted. "Doesn't make it any less funny. I can't believe you sleep here, isn't it?" "I don't know, unsettling." "Very," Mikumo sighed. "I get a face full of America every time I open my eyes. That bright, smiling face is so damn unnerving. I don't understand how a grown man could smile like that. He looks insane." He shuddered. 𝗑𝐻𝐻 chuckled at the rant. "You sound like a villain, hating All Might so much." "I don't hate him, he's just creepy. Anyways, let's go." Mikumo slid down the gutter, but 𝗑𝐻𝐻 didn't even need to. He ignited his hands and used the heat and the gas to propel himself upwards, almost like a rocket, albeit on a much smaller scale. 𝗑𝐻𝐻 smirked at the jealous look he shot him and motioned him along as he started walking. "You're such a show-off," Mikumo grumbled. "You don't have to make everything so dramatic." 𝗑𝐻𝐻 simply laughed. He couldn't help it. He enjoyed teasing and messing around with the brat. As they walked and reached a small field, his smirk grew into a full-fledged grin. "You ready for that ass-kicking, kid? Aren't you supposed to be teaching me? I just want to assess where you're at." The manic expression was becoming worse. "Let's fight." Sighing in acceptance, Mikumo lunged at him. 𝗑𝐻𝐻 let out a surprised laugh at the sudden attack and quickly dodged as he tried to trip him. Mikumo was just as fast and jumped over the attempt. "Wow, you're fast. I might actually have a worthy opponent here," 𝗑𝐻𝐻 exclaimed with an amused smirk on his face. Mikumo scowled and ran back at him, his fists clenched and ready to deliver a blow. As he approached and went for a punch, 𝗑𝐻𝐻 simply moved out of the way and mockingly said, "Too predictable." He dodged once again and used their position to twist Mikumo's arm around his back and force him to kneel. "Is that all you got?" 𝗑𝐻𝐻 laughed sarcastically. "You could at least try a bit harder to hit me." Mikumo knew he just toying with him and egging him on, but it still made his anger shoot through the roof. He didn't want to give 𝗑𝐻𝐻 the satisfaction of knowing that he was upset, even if his mind was in a frenzy as he tried to think of how he could escape 𝗑𝐻𝐻's hold on him. Finally, he saw an opportunity when 𝗑𝐻𝐻 lowered his guard, thinking he gave up. Mikumo took advantage of that fraction of a second to headbutt him in the nose, grinning at the pain sound he made. He let out a satisfied laugh. He actually managed to hit him. "So, am I worthy yet?" 𝗑𝐻𝐻 sniffed and wiped his nose, smiling with bloodied teeth. "Not even close." Mikumo's face dropped into a frown at the remark. There was no denying it. He felt pissed off. He felt this need to show him just how wrong he was. He needed to hit him with everything he had. The next punch wasn't some measly shot to his gut. It was full of force and hatred, and it went straight for 𝗑𝐻𝐻's face. He didn't manage to dodge that one. A loud slap resounded through the area as Mikumo's fist met his face. "Damn," 𝗑𝐻𝐻 muttered as he spat out a bit of blood. "You can pack a punch, kid. I'll give you that. I underestimated you." He wiped the remaining blood from his face and looked at him scrutinizingly. "All right, enough fun. We need to get down to work. You need to learn some basic fighting techniques. Let's start with something simple, like a punch, the same punch you just landed on me." Mikumo looked hesitant. "Are you sure? You don't look very good." "I'm fine. What kind of teacher would I be if I couldn't take an enhanced punch?" "A pretty awful one, sensei," he smirked. 𝗑𝐻𝐻 grimaced. "Never call me that again. You have a nasty habit of being a smartass, don't you?" he sighed, rolling his eyes, but couldn't stop a grin from spreading across his face. He liked that 𝐸𝐸𝐻 didn't back down just because he antagonized him. It's my natural charm. His eye twitched. Okay, maybe he didn't like it all that much. Fuck off, I'm your superior, or whatever. 𝐸𝐸𝐻 huffed. Oh, so now you want to pull rank. Just come over here so I can teach you. 𝗳𝗲𝗊 started by demonstrating a punch in slow motion. 𝐸𝐸𝐻 copied it pretty well, and he was able to repeat it a couple of times with only a little struggle. There were only a couple of things he had to correct him on. Don't cover your thumb. That's the best way to break or dislocate it. Make sure your fist and wrist are level with your arm. It should create a straight line. It makes sure your wrist doesn't get fucked up, and makes your punch more powerful. Something about energy. Kinetic energy. Yeah, that. 𝗳𝗲𝗊 had no idea what he was talking about. Tuck in your chin and keep your fists level with your cheeks. Don't forget to bend your elbows. Yeah, like that. Put your dominant foot behind you. He walked around 𝐸𝐸𝐻 and inspected his form. Pretty good, kid. When you're like this, you're protecting your face and your torso, where all your squishy important organs are. 𝐸𝐸𝐻 made a face. Gross. Suck it up. You did pretty good when we fought. You have an impressive amount of power behind your punches, and it'll probably only grow once you actually throw them the right way. 𝗳𝗲𝗊 dutifully ignored the way that he seemed to glow at the praise. When you're actually punching, your body is going to be moving forward, and the heel of your dominant foot will come off the ground. Right now, you're kind of sideways, but when you throw the punch, your heel will come off the ground, and you'll turn and face forwards. Slowly, 𝐸𝐸𝐻 moved his body in the way 𝗳𝗊𝗊 described and smiled slightly at how right it felt. 𝗳𝗊𝗊 nodded. Exactly. Damn, kid, you seem to have a real knack for this. I might not even need to teach you, but I want you to. He scoffed and smirked. I never said I was going to stop. He tapped his fingers on his thigh as he tried to think of anything else to say. Oh, yeah, make sure to snap your fist back into your original stance right after you punch. If you don't, you could leave yourself open. Also, you want the hit to land on your index and middle finger knuckles and use your legs. They're the actual power behind the punch. Technically, this is just a quick jab, but it seemed like the best thing to start with. 𝐸𝐸𝐻 soaked all the information up like a sponge. Sure, he had learned a lot of it online, but it was different seeing it in person. He practiced the jab a few times, and once he had 𝗳𝗊𝗊's approval, they moved on. He was shaking with energy, and his determination was so fierce that he seemed like a completely different person from before. 𝐸𝐸𝐻 had gotten a taste for the excitement of learning, and he wasn't going to stop until he mastered every single move possible. You're good when it comes to offense, but you lack a bit of defense. Here, I'll show you some basic blocks. 𝗳𝗊𝗊 started slowly at first, showing him the proper way to block and dodge attacks. He showed him how to block a punch and a kick while also teaching him how to block a weapon such as a knife. He also taught 𝐸𝐸𝐻 a few ways to counterattack after defending. A very important part of combat is defending yourself from your opponent's attacks. If you can't block a simple punch, imagine what would happen when your opponent uses something deadlier, like a gun, a knife, or even their quirk. You're lucky, though. A lot of people with flashy quirks don't bother to learn hand-to-hand combat, so you'll have the upper hand. 𝗳𝗊𝗊 slowly started to transition from cocky to serious. He was turning into a real teacher, and 𝐸𝐸𝐻 didn't even think he realized it. Slowly, he started explaining everything in detail, and the actual teaching aspect came naturally to him. It was impressive, and he was grateful. Without him, 𝐸𝐸𝐻 didn't think he would have ever realized these things. He also taught him a few dirty tricks and tactics when he was up against someone stronger or faster than him. He started teaching him the proper way to dodge a bullet. Never assume that your opponent won't use their lethal methods. If your opponent has any sort of weapon, no matter how small, you never let your guard down. That's a basic rule when facing an armed opponent. Sometimes, he wondered how 𝗳𝗊𝗊 knew all of this. A lot of it was probably due to his previous training with his father, but the darker things came from somewhere else. Consequently, he could be a harsh teacher at some moments. Now, let's get a bit more advanced. Let's move on to grapples. I already showed you how to pin your opponent, so now you're going to get a taste of what it's like to be on the receiving end. Before he could protest, 𝗳𝗊𝗊 grabbed him by the arm and pinned him to a nearby wall. He looked down at his captive with a cruel smirk growing on his lips. Now, can you escape? No, 𝐸𝐸𝐻 grumbled. Exactly, it's that easy. He continued with a chuckle. There's another rule that you have to remember. Don't fight fair. In a fight, your life is always at risk. You never know what they're capable of. They could be capable of killing you with a simple touch. You never want to hold anything back. Got it. Can you let me go now? 𝗳𝗊𝗊 obediently stepped back and watched as 𝐸𝐸𝐻 rubbed his wrist. It's going to get light soon, so we should spar again so you can use everything you've learned so far. He stepped away from him and held up his arms, awaiting what the teen planned to do. Go on, try grappling me, he said with a chuckle. 𝗳𝗊𝗊 waited calmly for 𝐸𝐸𝐻 to rush him. No matter how confident he was that he would be able to escape, this was a good opportunity to test his skills. If 𝐸𝐸𝐻 could hold down 𝗳𝗊𝗊, who was heavily trained and experienced, then he would be a beast in the future. 𝐲𝐻𝐻𝐻 took a few seconds to observe him. In a real fight, he most likely wouldn't have the time to think about what to do, so he was taking full advantage of that right now. 𝗬𝗲𝗍 stayed as still as possible while he let himself be examined. He smirked to himself. This is good. I expected him to rush right in. As he was thinking, 𝗲𝐻𝐻 suddenly rushed in and jabbed him in the gut, causing him to cough. 𝗬𝗲𝗍 barely had time to react before he could feel 𝗲𝐻𝐻's fist hit his midsection. He was taken aback just for a second, but he managed to regain his poise. 𝗬𝗲𝗍 quickly grabbed 𝗲𝐻𝐻's bicep and tried to pull him closer. With the way he was positioned, 𝗬𝗲𝗍 had the perfect opportunity to pin 𝗲𝐻𝐻 to the wall and stop his advance. Of course, 𝗲𝐻𝐻 didn't let him. He performed the escape maneuver perfectly and managed to slip out of his grasp and elbow 𝗬𝗲𝗍 in the stomach again. He gasped as he tried to get air into his lungs after the elbow hit his abdomen so suddenly. 𝗲𝐻𝐻's speed was so quick, 𝗬𝗲𝗍 barely had time to react to it. Good, you managed to slip out of my grip. Now try to pin me down. His tone was a bit more annoyed than before since the kid had landed quite a few attacks on him. 𝗬𝗲𝗍 stuck his foot out and managed to wipe out his feet from underneath him. 𝗲𝐻𝐻 tumbled to the ground, and he was able to get a few seconds to breathe. 𝗲𝐻𝐻 was strong, stronger than 𝗬𝗲𝗍. That was for sure. Though, there wasn't much to beat. He was skinny and malnourished. And he probably only lasted this long because of the constant fighting he was used to. The confidence he had in winning began to dim, but he didn't feel too bad about it. 𝗲𝐻𝐻 was good. And he performed the moves 𝗬𝗲𝗍 taught him with a grace that could only be achieved after years of experience. Except, he didn't have that experience. It was likely the physical enhancements that allowed him to move like that. But it didn't make it any less impressive. 𝗬𝗲𝗍 fell and hit the ground with a loud thud. He grimaced as he tried to get back up. Okay, that one was good, he said with a bit more respect toward 𝗲𝐻𝐻 than before. He couldn't help but be amazed at how quickly the kid could learn. I think that's enough for today. But I was having so much fun. He huffed. Kid, I think you're on par with a lot of vigilantes out there. And it's only been a few hours. 𝗲𝐻𝐻 looked at him, confused. Vigilantes? I haven't seen much about them. They normally don't get too popular. They all get caught too quickly. Most of them are just trying to be heroes because they couldn't become one normally. Why, do you want to become one? 𝗬𝗲𝗍 teased. He stayed silent, and 𝗬𝗲𝗍's face quickly fell. Come on, there's no way. I know you want to be a hero, but what? He challenged. Vigilantes are scum. All they do is mess with things where they don't belong and use it as an excuse to show off their quirk. They aren't trained or anything. Also, you're 10. He's 𝐬𝐻𝐻's age. So, I'm being trained by you. You can tell me the people and places I shouldn't bother with, and I don't have a flashy quirk. 𝗬𝗲𝗍 pursed his lips. What about 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐻? 𝗲𝐻𝐻 froze. He hadn't thought about that. The thought of getting seriously hurt, and in turn, hurting 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐻. It was unthinkable. A few bruises here and there were fine, but what if he got stabbed? Or cut? Burns wouldn't matter, but what if he died? He didn't know what to do. 𝗲𝐻𝐻 wanted to be a vigilante. He could help people, and that's all he wanted to do. There were a few things that he could do to limit the injuries he got. Only stick to thugs and low-level villains, wear a hero-grade outfit that a knife couldn't penetrate, and never start fights he couldn't win. 𝗲𝐻𝐻 stood at a crossroads. One side of him told him that he should follow his dreams of being a vigilante, and the other told him that he shouldn't put 𝐬𝐻𝐻 in danger. He didn't want to hurt 𝐬𝐻𝐻, but the thought of letting down everyone else who needed help was also hard for him to bear. If he was 𝐴𝐴 careful and protected himself as best he could, it should all be all right. Right, yeah, it'd be fine. 𝗬𝗲𝗍, do you have any criminal connections? Turns out, yes, he did. Even though 𝗬𝗲𝗍 wasn't enthusiastic about his choice, there was nothing he could do to change his mind. So, he settled on making sure 𝗲𝐻𝐻 didn't do anything irresponsible. He called his contact and cashed in a favor they owed him so that 𝗲𝐻𝐻 could get a high-quality vigilante disguise. He didn't know exactly what he wanted, so he let the designer go wild. The other thing he needed was weapons. Luckily, 𝗬𝗲𝗍 had amassed quite a few. He passed multiple knives over to 𝗲𝐻𝐻, feeling like this was a step too far. Was he really about to help a 10-year-old arm himself and send him off into a life of vigilantism? What was he thinking? With that done, they slipped back into the house just before 𝗀𝐻 got up for work. 𝗬𝗲𝗍 passed out on the couch, resolving to never stay up that late ever again. The days went by, and 𝗬𝗲𝗍 was hired by the cafe. He was forced to wear a uniform, and the first time 𝗲𝐻𝐻 saw it, he burst out laughing. Hey, 𝗬𝗲𝗍 called out, offended. I'll have you know that 𝐬𝐻𝐻 loved it. Apparently, the owner was a big fan of cats, so every employee was given a uniform based on a different breed. 𝗬𝗲𝗍 ended up getting a uniform based on a black 𝐻𝐻𝐻 𝐍𝐴, or a blue-eyed black cat, as the name suggests. It fit him perfectly, and the cat-themed shirt only added fuel to the fire. I do love it. It just happens to be hilarious at the same time. Over time, 𝗬𝗲𝗍 opened up to 𝗲𝐻𝐻. He learned that he had siblings and that his father was a hero. He always seemed uncomfortable when talking about himself, so 𝐀𝐻𝐻 never pushed. They spent many nights training, and he was learning a lot more, especially the fact that he was even more impressive at knife fighting than fist fighting. And eventually, his vigilante outfit was ready. It was time. The first time 𝐀𝐻𝐻 went out as a vigilante, it went terribly. Everything that could go wrong ended up going wrong. The night started out good, with him rescuing a group of people from a few villains, but as time progressed, he was attacked by even more villains than he had originally expected. On top of everything, he lost his knife. After a particularly violent attack by the villains, he was forced to make a run for it. With his injured body and no weapon, he didn't stand a chance. He had promised 𝗬𝗲𝗍 that he wouldn't engage in fights he couldn't win, and he intended to keep that promise. It helped that it was good for Izuku, too. Only fighting petty criminals and untrained villains lowered the risk of him getting hurt. 𝐀𝐻𝐻 had to admit that his vigilante costume was cool. He wore a mask that covered everything from his nose to his neck. Under everything, he had a tight, black, spandex-like long-sleeve shirt that covered the parts of his arms that were supposed to show, like the insides of his forearms, and a patch just above his elbows. Technically, he was only supposed to wear it in the winter, but he decided that extra protection was needed. It was made out of a fabric that was unable to be pierced by knives. Many pro heroes wore it, such as All Might. His jacket was green, but it was so dark it was almost black. The sleeves were short and padded, and they only really covered his shoulders. It had a hood with a clip inside that he could use for his hair, which made it so it would never fall off. The jacket had a zipper in front, a multitude of pockets, and custom knife sheaths. Everything was made out of that same material, except the jacket and pants were almost shiny, like leather. Bracers strapped on and covered his forearms, and fingerless gloves protected his palms from any blisters and helped with his grip. The pants were simple. They were the same shiny green color as everything else and only had a few pockets running down the sides. 2 holsters strapped onto his thighs, one on each. He wore special black combat boots, and overall, he thought he looked sick. It was easy to move around in, but he practiced in it for a few days before going out. Not that it did him any good. 𝐀𝐻𝐻 decided to stay out of that part of town and moved his patrol route over a little. Here, there wasn't as much crime, but when there was, it was only purse snatchers and small-time thieves. A few days after moving, everything was going fine. Whenever 𝐀𝐻𝐻 woke up before it was dark, he ended up not going out. He didn't want 𝐀𝐻𝐻 to start worrying and lose his chance of being a vigilante. 𝗬𝗲𝗍 kept training him, and they moved on from defending against enemies with knives to enemies with guns. Personally, 𝐀𝐻𝐻 thought it would be harder, but apparently he just picked up things unnaturally fast according to 𝗬𝗲𝗍. He was out on patrol one night, and he noticed a group of people robbing a jewelry store and fleeing into an alley, not wanting to be a bystander and let them get away. He quickly ran up to the group and tried to stop them. There were only 3 of them, and 𝐀𝐻𝐻 was confident that he could win. The group was not happy about his interruption and began to fight back. One of them punched 𝐀𝐻𝐻 in the gut, making him gasp for air. The other tried to stab 𝐀𝐻𝐻, but he managed to dodge the attack by jumping backward. "You bastard. Hey, Torch, Silk," one of them shouted at the others. "That's the vigilante from the town over. What's he doing here?" "I don't know, Phantom. He looks pretty scrawny. I think we can take him." 𝐀𝐻𝐻 gasped dramatically. "What if I was a girl?" The first one, Phantom, leered at him. "Then I'd have much more fun after we beat you." He growled and flickered out of existence. Unsure of where he was, 𝐀𝐻𝐻 quickly scaled the side of a building and looked down, trying to figure out what their quirks were. Phantom seemed to have some type of invisibility quirk, and another one, Torch, had a pyrokinesis quirk if the balls of flames were anything to go by. The third one, Silk, seemed to be shooting something out of his fingertips. They looked like very thin threads, but they were so thin that he could only see them when they reflected light. No, they weren't threads, it was spider silk. 𝐀𝐻𝐻 almost laughed out loud at their names, but he was busy fighting. He couldn't track Phantom due to his invisibility quirk, but he managed to dodge Torch's attacks pretty easily because he was standing still. Soon, he realized that his biggest problem was going to be Silk. His spider silk was tough enough to cut 𝐀𝐻𝐻's skin, and it was also very thin, which made it hard to track. That combined with the guy's long reach meant that 𝐀𝐻𝐻 was going to have a hard time getting close. The more he looked at the 3 of them, the more things he realized. Torch's fire was giving off a lot of light, which made the silk easier to see. Also, Phantom wasn't fully invisible. With the help of the extra light, you could see ripples in the air where he was standing. The 3 of them had impressive quirks, but they didn't work very well together. A plan formed in his mind, and he jumped down from the roof in the middle of them. Silk reached out and directed the threads to speed toward 𝐀𝐻𝐻, but he jumped out of the way just as Torch threw one of the flaming balls at him. The fire met the threads, and just as he predicted, they were flammable. The silk quickly caught on fire, and it started to spread down the threads and back to Silk's fingertips. He yelped as the fire burned him, and by that time, 𝐀𝐻𝐻 was already behind him. He took advantage of his pain and slammed the hilt of his new knife into Silk's temple, causing him to drop. He heard the shuffle of footsteps and ducked as Phantom swung where his head used to be. Backing up, he looked over at Torch. He was sweating and shaking, and Makumo knew that he was angry. It must be the side effect of his quirk, uncontrollable anger. Deciding to focus on him, Makumo weaved and dodged as Torch shot more and more flames at him. Once he saw that Torch was getting really angry, he searched for Phantom's telltale ripples and jumped behind him, holding him in place with his strength. "Are you okay over there?" Makumo asked Torch with faux concern. "You look a little burnt out." He snorted and grinned as Torch let out a furious yell and hurled 2 giant flames at him, unknowing that his invisible teammate was right in the line of fire. Phantom struggled in his hold, and Makumo ducked behind him as the flames hit. The heat from the fire licked up his arms and over his face, and he winced at the shouts of pain coming from Phantom. He was barbecued for sure. Makumo knew it wasn't the most morally correct thing to do, but these people weren't innocent, and there are no security cameras in this alley. No one would know what happened here. The fire finally stopped, and Phantom dropped to the ground, unable to support his own body. Makumo looked down at him and winced. Never mind, he was just dead. Torch was heaving, and only small flames flickered above his palms. His quirk was completely spent. He was slumped on the ground and tried to stand up only to fall again. Makumo walked up to his opponent and put his foot on his chest, pressing down to pin him to the floor. "You put up a good fight, I'll give you that. But your power's spent," he said, his voice steady and unconcerned. "Now, are you going to come with me, or will I have to carry you?" Torch wheezed and looked up at Makumo with barely concealed mania. "I'm not going anywhere." He ripped a pouch on his pants open and pulled out a red syringe. Before Makumo could grab it, he had already plunged it into his neck and injected the strange liquid. Makumo stared at the syringe, worried about what the effects could be. As the liquid began to work its way through Torch's veins, he began to convulse, and fire around him flickered back to life. It suddenly began to grow, getting bigger and hotter. He was forced to back up to the other side of the alley because of how intense it was getting. "What the hell?" Torch let out a laugh that bordered on insane, and he slowly lifted himself up. His eyes were blazing orange as the flames reflected in them, and his dilated pupils stared straight into Makumo's soul. He stared Torch down with his hands firmly clutched in fists. He wasn't scared yet, but he was cautious of the situation. Contrary to popular opinion, Makumo didn't like killing people, but sometimes it was necessary, like it was right now. "God, I hope no heroes hear this." He pulled out a pistol that 𝗑𝐲𝐻 had ever so kindly given to him and aimed it at the fiery criminal. "Sorry about this." Without waiting for a response, he pulled the trigger multiple times. The shots echoed throughout the small alley, but Torch waved his hand and a wall of fire appeared in between himself and the bullets. They met, and the bullets melted into a pile of molten metal. Shit. His quirk evolved after he injected himself. His fire was hotter, and he wasn't limited to just flaming balls anymore. Makumo realized that his gun wasn't going to do much against this guy. It wasn't that strong of a weapon, and it couldn't pierce through the wall of fire that the villain had created. Torch walked closer to him, and the heat followed. The metal of the gun was starting to heat up to almost painful levels, and he dropped it with a hiss. It clattered on the ground, and he watched as it started to glow red with heat. "That was my best gun." Makumo raised his arms to shield his face. He was now starting to regret his earlier bravado regarding this criminal. Torch shot beams of pure heat at him, and he was only dodging them by the skin of his teeth. The plastic trash cans that lined the ground were melting, and the smell made him grimace. Every beam that missed him exploded everything in his path. It was getting loud, and there was no doubt that someone had already reported it. He needed to finish the fight, quickly. The problem was, he had no idea what to do. Makumo knew he was outmatched, but he couldn't let a madman rampage through the town. Luckily, he had only gotten away with a few minor burns and singes to his clothing. Torch was advancing on him, and he didn't know how much longer he was going to be able to fight him in such an enclosed space. Makumo was out of options. Even if he was able to dodge everything the villain threw at him, he was certain that he wouldn't be able to deal any considerable damage. His gun was gone, so there was nothing he could do except run and wait for him to tire out. As he prepared himself for the worst, he heard the sound of running footsteps drawing closer. It wasn't Torch, because his flames suddenly disappeared. The cool night air was a shock to his system after getting used to the heat of Torch's quirk. Gray bandages wrapped around Torch's body and slammed him into the pavement, knocking him out. A figure swung down from the rooftop and Makumo stared at the man. He was wearing all black and had a gray scarf around his neck. Eraserhead. It was about 6 years since he last saw him, a couple of days before Loud Cloud's death. He looked a lot older now, though that was to be expected. A new piece that joined his outfit was a pair of yellow goggles that covered his eyes. Makumo was glad that Eraser was sure not to recognize him, but it also made him sad. He was his favorite hero, but right now he was a vigilante, and Eraser was looking at him suspiciously. The two living villains were tied up, while Phantom's body lay on the ground, unmoving. "You all right, kid?" His heart tugged. God, this was so stupid. Mikumo had barely talked to him for 15 minutes. 6 years ago, so why did he feel so happy about being called that by him again? "Yeah, I'm fine," he muttered and stood up. It's not that he didn't want to stay and chat, he did. But he was currently doing something illegal, so he tried to slowly shift away from him, looking for a way out. Eraserhead noticed and he narrowed his eyes. "Hold on, can you tell me what happened here?" Mikumo stilled and said, "I was just walking home and I saw them rob the store down the street. They cornered me and talked about not wanting any witnesses, and they pulled a gun on me. You know, like a liar. I heard multiple shots go off." Eraserhead decided not to comment on the fact that it was almost 1 a.m. and someone this young definitely wouldn't be walking home at this hour. He decided to slip a little bit of the truth in. The guy with the flame quirk injected himself with something that made his quirk go berserk. The dead guy tried to shoot him and got killed. It wasn't the full truth, but it would do. Eraserhead seemed to slump and he looked at Mikumo with tired eyes. "Did you see what the stuff he injected himself with looked like? Did you catch what it was called?" "No, but it was red." He sighed, sounding 10 years older than he actually was. "What's your name?" Mikumo hesitated for a moment before saying, "𝐍𝐿, before he started going out as a vigilante. 𝗬𝗲 reminded him that he needed to come up with a name to be his vigilante name. So, he did some research. Many names didn't fit, but when he found the name 𝐍𝐿, he laughed out loud. It meant pure, and he chose it purely for the irony. It also had the added bonus of sounding cool. 𝐬𝐻 looked at 𝐍𝐿, really looked at him. He couldn't see it before because of the darkness, but the kid was definitely wearing a costume. He recognized the material of it. Hisashi wore the same. It was hero-grade material, which was expensive, and he had an entire outfit of it. To be honest, he only called 𝐍𝐿 a kid because of his height, but now that he could see his eyes, he was certain that he was a child. His eyes roamed over his outfit and caught onto a few interesting things. There were pouches around his thighs, and was that a gun holster? Clearly, the kid had lied about almost everything. 𝐬𝐻 didn't doubt that Trigger was involved, based on the scene in front of him, but the rest of the story was a little suspicious. He narrowed his eyes. "Where did you get your outfit? Seems a bit much for a random civilian that just happened to stumble across a robbery." 𝐍𝐿 laughed nervously and backed up. "It was a gift. There's nothing special about it. This kid sucked at lying. And the mask. I'm sick." He coughed unconvincingly. 𝐬𝐻 was unimpressed. "You're a child and a vigilante. Care to tell me why?" 𝐍𝐿 hummed. "Not really. Why not go to a hero school? You seem like a promising candidate, and a little direction could help you reach your full potential." 𝐬𝐻's tone was more encouraging than accusatory, hoping he would calm down and not run away. "I can't go to a hero school," he scoffed. "It's practically impossible." "How come?" Apparently, he had pushed him too far. 𝐍𝐿 spun around and booked it down the street, weaving in between buildings and trying to throw him off his tail. 𝐬𝐻 ran across the roofs above him and dialed his emergency contact, careful not to lose his balance. "Aizawa, what's up?" "Tsukachi, I came across another vigilante on my patrol. His name is 𝐍𝐿, and he wears an outfit of hero-grade materials, mostly green. He wears a mask, but his eyes are green, and he's short, around 120 centimeters. A shuffling of papers sounded over the phone before they stopped. "That's really short." "Yeah," 𝐬𝐻 huffed. "It's probably because he's a child. For being someone so young, 𝐍𝐿 was fast. 𝐬𝐻 was keeping pace with him, and that was with his capture weapon helping him. Note that he has a speed-enhancing quirk. He's almost able to outrun me." Tsukachi whistled. "He's a pretty fast kid. Is there anything else you can tell me about him?" "There's not much more to tell. He's very adept at lying. If he wasn't dressed like he was, I would have believed him." 𝐬𝐻 paused as he watched 𝐍𝐿 pull himself up the side of a building from the fire escape with seemingly no trouble. It took an incredible amount of grip strength to do that, and in his 6 years of being a hero, he had only seen other heroes do that if they had support equipment or a strength quirk. He cleared his throat. "Tsukachi, add strength quirk to your notes, too." Deciding he was done observing, 𝐬𝐻 triggered his quirk and waited for the inevitable. Except, 𝐍𝐿 kept running and dived into the crowd at a concert as if nothing had happened. Mikumo was panicking. He was trying so hard to stay out of Eraserhead's line of sight, but he knew that it would be nigh impossible. Honestly, he was surprised that he hadn't erased his quirk yet. With his enhanced body, he was much faster than the average person, but he was having trouble fully escaping Eraserhead. There were too many buildings for him to be able to outrun Eraser over the roofs, so he decided to try to get back down to the street to lose him in the crowd. He followed the sound of music as quickly as he could and threw himself off of the low roof, rolling to absorb some of the impact. It didn't help much, though, and he winced as his ankle rolled underneath him. In front of him was a decent-sized concert, and people were jumping as the band on the stage slammed out metal music. But Mikumo didn't have any time to waste enjoying it. so he twisted his mouth shut and limped as quickly as he could into the crowd. The flashing lights made it hard to see, so he only hoped it was the same for Eraserhead. Everyone at the concert was taller than him, and they were all shoulder to shoulder with limited space to move. It was uncomfortable, but it served as a great cover to get away. He quickly decided to try and blend in, so he unclipped his hood and pulled it down and snatched a black beanie off the head of another man. He spun around with an indignant expression, but 𝐀𝐦 was already ducking away into the crowd. With the beanie on covering his hair and the throngs of people giving him an adequate place to lay low, he allowed himself to relax, well, as much as you could at a metal concert. It was loud and harsh, and people were jumping and moshing, but he liked the music and started to jump along with them. No one took notice of how short he was. Everyone was too occupied with the music or whatever illegal substance they were smoking. The couple minutes he was supposed to spend hiding turned into an hour as he got swept up by the music and the atmosphere. By the time the concert ended, the sky was starting to lighten with the morning sun. Clearly, Eraserhead hadn't stuck around long enough to try and find him. As he ran home, he tried to ignore the stabbing pain in his ankle. It was painful to put pressure on it, but he had no choice if he wanted to get home before 𝐀𝐦 woke up. Based on how the sun wasn't quite over the horizon yet, it was about 6 a.m., and 𝐀𝐦 got up for work at 6:30. Luckily, he was only about a 15-minute walk away. When 𝐀𝐦 finally clambered up the gutter and into his room, he was exhausted. It took so much effort to peel off his vigilante outfit and hide it, so by the time he was done and in bed, he wanted nothing more than to fall away into the abyss and let Izuku take over. Unfortunately, nothing ever goes the way he wants it to. A knock sounded at the bedroom door, and he groaned and rolled over. "Izuku, are you awake?" 𝐀𝐦's voice sounded through the door. Without responding, 𝐀𝐦 squeezed his eyes shut. He was so tired, and just when he thought he would be able to get some rest, 𝐀𝐦 had come to ruin his plans. He stayed as silent as he could, hoping that she would give up and go away. He had a splitting headache from all the music at the concert, and he wasn't really in the mood to deal with her right now. Against his better judgment, he cracked open an eye and said, "Yeah, I'm awake." "Good morning, sweetheart. 𝗬𝗲𝗊 already left for work," 𝐀𝐦 chimed, walking over to his bed and leaning down to give him a little peck on the forehead. "How did you sleep?" "Okay, I guess," 𝐀𝐦 replied, sitting up and internally crying. The pain in his ankle wasn't getting any better, either. 𝐀𝐦 frowned slightly and put a hand on his head. "Oh, that doesn't sound too good. Are you sure you're all right?" "Yeah, I'm fine." She huffed and smiled slightly. "If you say so. Anyways, what would you like for breakfast?" 𝐀𝐦 was way too tired to do anything, let alone choose breakfast, so he mumbled, "Whatever you're having," and watched as 𝐀𝐦 nodded and left. He sighed to himself before getting up and hopping on one leg into the bathroom. Putting any more pressure on his leg would be bad, but the only other option would be to go to the hospital, and that was something he wanted to avoid at all costs. 𝐀𝐦 startled slightly as the cold tile of the bathroom floor made its presence known. The headache he had was absolutely brutal, and it only seemed to get worse the longer he was awake. With the sun streaming through the window and the bathroom lights all on, the brightness was enough to make his head pound even more. With a low groan, he slowly made his way over to the sink and turned on the faucet, splashing some cool water on his face to try and dull some of the pain. He leaned his weight onto the sink counter and held himself up by his hands. Letting his head hang down, he closed his eyes and tried not to fall asleep standing up. Unbeknownst to him, the water covering his hands was causing them to slowly slide to the edge of the counter, and when one of his hands finally slipped off, he had to quickly push away to avoid his face being slammed into it. The shock caused him to put both feet on the ground, sending jolts of pain through his ankle. He cried out and accidentally kicked over a small stool next to the sink. Hearing the commotion, 𝐀𝐦 ran from the kitchen and opened up the bathroom door. "Izuku, what's wrong?" 𝐀𝐦 didn't respond right away, too distracted by his ankle and the pounding in his head to say anything. Tears prickled at the edge of his eyes, and he bit down on his bottom lip to try and stop them from spilling over. "It's my ankle," he choked out through gritted teeth, blinking rapidly in the hopes that there were no tears on his cheeks. He couldn't handle a lecture right now, not when everything hurt so much. 𝐀𝐦 didn't say anything initially, only staring at him worriedly as she slowly approached. Oh God, what happened? Obviously, he couldn't tell her what actually happened, so he racked his brain for a lie and hoped it would work. "I was trying to reach for the new bottle of toothpaste on the top shelf, but the stool slipped out from under me and I landed weird." 𝐀𝐦 breathed slowly, trying to get his emotions under control. He could see how his ankle was starting to turn purple because he had twisted it hours ago and hoped that 𝐀𝐦 wouldn't notice. She grimaced and slowly helped him stand up. "I think we should take you to the hospital, honey. You could have sprained it." 𝐀𝐦 wanted to tell her no, that he was fine, but he knew that it was for the best if he went. Walking on a sprained ankle for as long as he did couldn't have been good for it. "Yeah, okay," he muttered reluctantly. The last thing he needed was to be stuck in the hospital for hours, and more importantly, having to come up with a lie to keep 𝐀𝐻 from finding out the truth. Once they were in the car and on the way to the hospital, he sat back in his seat and sighed, rubbing his eyes wearily. This day was off to a terrible start, not really what he had been expecting from his first night out as a vigilante. After what felt like an eternity in the car, 𝐀𝐻 was finally at the hospital. They checked in, went through the usual questions and waiting process, and soon enough he was laying in one of the hospital beds waiting for the doctor, Dr. 𝐀𝐦, to see him. It was honestly a relief to stretch out and rest his legs after walking around the city all night. But his ankle was still bothering him and keeping him awake. He tried to focus on his breathing instead of the pain, willing himself to stay calm and not lose his composure. As if on cue, the doctor finally entered the room and greeted him, taking a look at his ankle. "How long ago did this happen? It's already very swollen, and we might need to do an X-ray." "Just this morning, maybe an hour ago," 𝐀𝐻 responded. 𝐀𝐻 nodded silently, not wanting to admit out loud how he had really gotten his injury. He could only imagine what his mother would say if she found out, and the thought of the look on her face was enough to make him squirm in the bed. Dr. 𝐀𝐦 hummed slightly and marked a few things down on his clipboard. "All right, I'm going to go ahead and order an X-ray. You can wait here, and I'll send in a nurse to do a few more tests while I look at your medical history." "Thank you," 𝐀𝐻 replied, giving the doctor a small smile. 𝐀𝐻 leaned back in his bed, silently listening as the doctor walked out and a nurse came in to take his vitals. The whole process was quick and relatively painless, but it still felt like an eternity before he was finally wheeled off to get his X-ray. Thankfully, it didn't take too long. The easy part was over, and the doctor wrapped and bandaged his foot so that it wouldn't move, and they went home to wait for the X-ray to come back. According to the doctor, it would only take a couple of days at most. He was excused from school, and 𝐀𝐻 was finally able to fall asleep. He wondered what 𝐬𝐻 would do when he realized he was hurt, but he was too tired to dwell on that any longer. Sleep finally took him, and everything went dark. The moment 𝐬𝐻 opened his eyes, he knew something was wrong. First of all, it was way too bright outside. He was sure that it was almost the middle of the day, and he was also sure that it was a Friday, a school day. Why he was home, he didn't know. He had always lost time, so he was used to being confused about what was going on, but that didn't mean it wasn't scary. Ever since he was 4, he would periodically have blackouts that would last between hours and almost a full day. The first time it happened, 𝐬𝐻 didn't think too much about it. He was only 4, after all. The only thing he remembered was running into his mom's room crying and begging her not to get 𝐀𝐻 in trouble. She asked if he remembered eating dinner, and he didn't. It was odd, of course, but that was the first time it had happened. Then it happened again. It was longer that time, a few hours. He woke up at home in bed, so he got up to get ready to go to preschool. When he walked out into the kitchen, he saw his mom making food. He asked, "Mama, when are we walking to school?" She looked at him, confused, before replying, "Dear, you already went." This confused 𝐬𝐻, and his young mind couldn't handle it. Worried, his mom had taken him to a hospital. There was nothing wrong with him, but that didn't calm her down. He tried talking to the doctor, tried to explain, but they didn't believe him. He overheard the doctor talking to his mom, telling her that he was lying just to get some attention. 𝐬𝐻 knew that he wasn't lying, and even though the doctor told his mom he was, he could tell that she was still concerned. The blackouts persisted for all of his childhood, but nobody believed him. Not his teachers, his classmates, and especially not his doctors. Eventually, he just decided to stop telling people altogether. The blackouts didn't happen often, maybe twice a month at most, but he could never remember what happened during those periods of time. It was like his brain had been wiped clean and all his memory had been replaced with a thick black void. 𝐬𝐻 never had any evidence besides his word to prove that these blackouts were actually happening, so he just assumed that he was going insane. He learned to live with it. Along with the blackouts came other things. More recently, he would wake up feeling sore, with bruises he didn't remember having before he went to sleep. Most of the time, he assumed that those were places where 𝐀𝐻 had hit him, and the bruises appeared while he slept. There was also the problem of the medical supplies appearing in his room. About once a week, there would be new items in the box between the wall and his bookshelf. It wasn't the most clever hiding spot, but his mom wasn't nosy and didn't invade his space, so it was never found. 𝐬𝐻 was grateful for the medical supplies, but it was concerning. He didn't know how they were getting there, but he assumed it had to do with his blackouts. 𝐬𝐻 was convinced that he was losing his mind. He couldn't explain these blackouts, the bruises, or the medical supplies that kept appearing in his room. Everything was just too strange and he couldn't make sense of it. He tried to convince himself that these things weren't actually happening, but it was getting harder and harder for him to convince himself of that. He was beginning to think that maybe he was losing his grip on reality, and that maybe he needed help. During the blackouts, he knew that he was still up and walking around. He did chores, had conversations, and went to class. He just couldn't remember it. The last thing he remembered doing before every blackout was going to sleep. After that, nothing. And now, based on the throbbing pain in his ankle, he had got himself badly hurt during one. Even the pain wasn't enough to snap him out of a blackout. And that's what scared him the most. They were slowly taking a toll on 𝐬𝐸. He was constantly tired and confused, and he began to fear that he would eventually have a permanent blackout and never wake up. He was becoming increasingly desperate for answers, and he began searching for any possible explanations for what was happening to him. He searched through library books at school and spent hours on the internet, but he could never find anything that could explain what was happening to him. It was driving him insane, and he didn't know what to do. There was no one he could turn to for help, and he felt completely alone and hopeless. He was only 10, but at that moment, he felt much older. 𝐬𝐸 lay in bed for a while, not quite sleeping but not quite awake either. He was drifting and only snapped out of it when his mom opened the door and called him out for dinner. 𝗬𝗲𝗍 was home from work and they all sat down around the table. There was light conversation, but 𝐬𝐸 only mumbled a few words before heading to bed after only finishing half of his plate. The next morning, he was woken up with exciting news. The X-rays that he didn't remember getting were finally ready, and Dr. 𝐀𝐦 wanted them to come in so they could speak about it. Even though it was a Saturday, 𝗬𝗲𝗍 still had work. So, after breakfast, they all parted ways. When they got there, they were surprised to see that he was already waiting for them, and he quickly rushed them into a small room with the printed X-rays hanging on a board. He picked up a file and opened it, shuffling it around before looking up at 𝐬𝐸. I just want to ask, before we get into this, you are quirkless, correct? This X-ray from some years ago shows that you have the extra toe joint. He held up a smaller picture of an X-ray of his foot, the day he was diagnosed quirkless. 𝐬𝐸 nodded, confused. Yes, sir. All right. Well, Dr. 𝐀𝐦 cleared his throat. With the X-ray that we took, we have good news. You only sprained your ankle, which is fairly easy to treat and heal. The other thing, well, 𝐴𝐸 started to get worried. And he continued, when we took the X-ray of your ankle, you can see some of your foot in it, too. I'm puzzled because although you're quirkless, and even have the X-ray to prove it, it appears that you don't have an extra toe joint in this X-ray. 𝐴𝐸 stared at Dr. 𝐀𝐦 with an open mouth. She was shocked, obviously. What do you mean he doesn't have the extra joint? I was there for the first X-ray. How can he not have it? Dr. 𝐀𝐦 sighed and shook his head unknowingly. I'm not sure, ma'am, but we're offering you another X-ray for free, just so we can check this out again. Breathing out, 𝐴𝐸 looked over to 𝐬𝐸. Is that all right with you? Sure, I don't mind, 𝐬𝐸 replied. He was so caught up in the moment and trying to process everything Dr. 𝐀𝐦 had just said that he had completely forgotten to be nervous. He was now mostly just confused and curious. What Dr. 𝐀𝐦 had said about his bones made no sense to him, and he wanted to figure out what was going on. So, he agreed to the free X-ray and watched as the doctor and the nurses got everything ready for him. It was painless and quick, but they didn't have to wait very long for the results as 𝐬𝐸 had thought. His X-rays were rushed through, and within 30 minutes it was finally done. Dr. 𝐀𝐦 came into the room with another file and a straight face. I have the results here, but I'm going to pin these up on the board so you can see. He slipped 3 photos from the file and pinned them on the board next to him. The one on the left is the first X-ray when you were little. The middle is the one from a couple of days ago, and the right is the one that we took today. He pointed at the small toe of the first photo. Here you can see an extra joint, but if you look in the same spot in the middle photo, it's not there. What's even more strange is that in the X-ray we took today, the extra joint has seemed to reappear. Sure enough, there was an extra joint in his toe in the most recent photo, but not one in the middle photo. Another thing looked strange to 𝐬𝐸, though. Why do the bones in the middle photo look different from the ones on the right? Ah, Dr. 𝐀𝐦 hummed. That's something else I wanted to talk about. See, since quirks have developed, so has technology. There's a type of X-ray called a DEXA scan. It's able to determine how dense your bones are. In the past, a normal X-ray and a DEXA scan were separate procedures, but now they've been able to be combined into one standard X-ray machine. It's easier and more efficient, especially for people with strength quirks whose bones are denser than the average person. He sighed. That's why the photos look so different. In the middle, your bones are actually denser than your bones on the right, so much so that it's comparable to someone with a very impressive strength quirk. Somehow, within the last few days, your bones have actually mutated to become denser, completely erase your extra joint, and go back to normal by today. This sort of thing can only be caused by a quirk, so let me ask you, has anything been happening lately? The first thing that came into 𝐬𝐸's mind was the blackouts. He got the X-ray while blacked out, and everything on it was messed up. That's the only explanation because, besides that, everything in his life was normal. I can tell you have something on your mind. What is it? Dr. 𝐀𝐦 asked. 𝐬𝐸 curled into himself. Well, there has been something going on, for a while actually. I've told other doctors, but no one ever believed me. Well, obviously this is a problem, and it seems it's been happening quite frequently. I promise that I'll take whatever you say seriously. I've been having blackouts, 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐻 hesitantly began. The words were difficult for him to say out loud, and he felt embarrassed, but he forced himself to keep going. For the past few years, I've been losing time, sometimes minutes, sometimes hours. It doesn't happen too often. Maybe 2 or 3 times every couple of months. The thing is, it's been going on since I was 4. Dr. 𝐀𝐦 looked contemplative. That's around the time when quirks start to manifest. He mused. Go on, tell me more. 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐻 shifted, a little uncomfortable. Well, I never black out when I'm awake. I always fall asleep first and then wake up later in the day, or sometimes even the next night. Also, this is weird, but I never, jolt awake during the day. It's almost as if my blackout self laid down to fall asleep, and that's when I wake up from it. Your blackout self. Oh yeah, when I black out, I still walk and talk and have conversations like normal, but I don't remember any of it. Actually, he trailed off. Actually, when I got the X-ray a few days ago, I was blacked out. I didn't even know I was injured until I woke up in my bed later that day. Dr. 𝐀𝐦's eyes widened a little. So you have no memory of taking the first X-ray? 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐻 shook his head and Dr. 𝐀𝐦 frowned. It doesn't seem like much of a coincidence that your bones were stronger and your body was mutated at the same time you were blacked out. It seems as if when you fall asleep, your blackout self wakes up, and when he falls asleep, you wake up. I think we should order a sleep study. But before that, he turned to 𝐀𝐻𝐻. Ma'am, did you have any idea this was going on? Well, she stuttered. Other doctors had told me that he was just doing it for attention, but I never really believed them. I know my son, and he's not someone to lie about this type of thing. He nodded. All right. Would you both be willing to do a sleep study sometime soon? This problem seems to start when you fall asleep, so monitoring what happens seems like the best course of action to figure out what's happening. I suspect it's a quirk. But, 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐻 started. But I have the extra toe joint. True, but I suspect that there's a reasonable explanation. Ma'am, is there a history of quirkless people in your or your husband's family? 𝐻𝐻𝐻 furrowed her brows as she thought. Yes, my family line has had many quirkless people. If we weren't quirkless, then we normally have very weak quirks. My husband's family, though, is the opposite. They have a history of very powerful quirks, with his being the weakest so far. How come? Dr. 𝐀𝐦 smiled slightly. I figured as much. This was common when quirks were first appearing. Thus many people had quirks and the extra joint. All of their family members had the extra joint, so they did too. Eventually, our bodies mutated to get rid of the extra joint as time went on. Combined with your family's history of quirkless people, and your husband's history of powerful quirks, I believe that your son's body is mutated to have the extra joint, along with a quirk. That's, 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐻 gaped. It's quite the medical anomaly. That's for sure, Dr. 𝐀𝐦 chuckled. I am still a little puzzled about why your body changes so much when blacked out. But a sleep study could give us answers. I think we should do it, sweetie, 𝐻𝐻𝐻 said. Her voice wavered in worry. The idea of someone watching him sleep was not appealing, but it could help to figure out what was going on. A tad reluctantly, he agreed to one. With promises to schedule an appointment soon, the two of them left the hospital and headed back home. The ride home was a little awkward and the air was filled with worry, mostly coming from 𝐻𝐻𝐻. 𝐬𝐻𝐻 was lost in thought as he stared out the window. If I can't remember anything when I black out, does that mean the me that's in control during the blackouts doesn't remember anything that I do? He sighed a little and continued staring at the passing landscape. It's like that person isn't even me. I wonder if I could talk to them somehow. Latching onto that thought, he sat up a little straighter. Wait, can I? What if I used a note or something and put it next to my bed, so when I fall asleep, blackout me will wake up and see it? The thought continued to churn in his mind, even as he was walking up the stairs to the apartment. 𝗬𝗲𝗿 was already home, but 𝐬𝐻𝐻 missed the concerned look on his face when he didn't answer his call the first time. 𝐬𝐻𝐻, you good? He asked. I think I have another personality in me that wakes up when I go to sleep. 𝗬𝗲𝗿 stared at him, and 𝐬𝐻𝐻 could have sworn he paled a little. That sounds rough, huffing out a laugh at his attempt at consolation. 𝐬𝐻𝐻 took his wrist and dragged him over to the kitchen where 𝐻𝐻 was starting dinner. Enough depressing stuff, let's help Mom cook. 𝗬𝗿 groaned lightheartedly and grabbed some ingredients from the fridge and started chopping. You know I'm ass at cooking, kid. Tutting. 𝐻𝐻 turned around and swatted him lightly with a spatula. No swearing in the kitchen, young man, she reprimanded unseriously. Okay, Mom. 𝐻𝐻 smiled and turned back to her cooking. You can call me Mom anytime you like, you know that, right? 𝗬𝗿 froze and 𝐬𝐻𝐻 snickered into his shoulder, which earned him a flick on the forehead. Shut up, 𝗬𝗿 grumbled, embarrassed. Later that night, 𝐬𝐻𝐻 decided to write a note. It read, hello to the other personality who's in my body. I think you wake up when I go to sleep, so here I am, writing a note to you. If you exist, write something. I guess. I'd look pretty stupid if I just wrote to no one. I'll check this note again when I wake up tomorrow. 𝐬𝐡𝐚𝐭. He set it on his nightstand and fell asleep, slightly nervous. The next morning, the first thing 𝐬𝐡𝐚𝐭 did was roll over and grab the note. His eyes scanned the paper, and when he got to the bottom, his heart dropped. Hi Mikumo during the night. When Mikumo woke up during the night and saw the note next to the bed, the only thing he could do was panic. Why was 𝐬𝐡𝐭 asking about him? What could have happened in the last few days to make him suspect that he was there? He snatched up the piece of paper and ran as quietly as he could out into the living room and shook 𝗬𝗲𝗍 awake, dodging a flaming hand in the process. As soon as he was coherent, Mikumo held up the note. 𝗬𝗲𝗍, what is this? He yelled. What are you holding? 𝗬𝗲𝗍 asked, stretching and yawning before he reached and grabbed the piece of paper and took a moment to read it. 𝐬𝐡𝐭 left a note asking about you. Oh, shit. I know. What am I even supposed to say? Mikumo started to pace back and forth. He shouldn't have been able to know. Did anything happen that you know of? 𝗬𝗲𝗍 shook his head. No, nothing I can. He cut himself off and sat up straighter. Oh, I remember now. 𝐴𝐻𝐾 pulled me aside after 𝐬𝐡𝐭 left for his room and told me what happened during the visit to the doctor. He told Mikumo everything about the different x-rays, what 𝐬𝐡𝐭 had said about the blackouts, and about the sleep study that Dr. 𝐀𝐦 wanted to have done. Throughout the explanation, Mikumo became more and more resigned that he would finally have to tell 𝐬𝐡𝐭 about his existence. What if I just didn't say anything back? He argued weakly. 𝗬𝗲𝗍 looked at him sternly. You know you can't do that. He practically already knows, and you've been hiding it from him for years. Technically, so have I, just not for as long. I know you're not 10, so stop acting like you are and own up to your mistake. Mikumo frowned and looked away. He knew what 𝗬𝗲𝗍 had said was right, but he couldn't help the fear he felt in his chest. What if 𝐬𝐡𝐭 didn't understand? What if he was mad? What if he didn't accept Mikumo for who he was? All right, Mikumo mumbled, letting his shoulders slump, defeated. You're right. I need to do what's best for 𝐬𝐡𝐭. I'll tell him the truth. Good. Now go write a response and I'll deal with him in the morning. Feeling a little scared, he trudged back to his bedroom and wrote his response. To pass the time, he practiced some of the forms 𝗬𝗲𝗍 had taught him and finally went to bed at around 6:30 a.m., a guilty feeling in his chest the whole time. The present. 𝐬𝐡𝐭 stared at the paper, his thoughts a mess of confusion. He wanted to rip it up and pretend he'd never seen it. He didn't want to believe it, but the more he looked at it, the more he knew it had to be true. He'd be lying if he said he wasn't scared. His heart was beating fast and his palms were starting to sweat. As his panic grew, he realized that he would need time to think. He would need space, too. He couldn't talk to Mikumo now. He was too scared, too upset, and he felt so very confused. He needed time to process all of this. But where could he go? 𝐬𝐡𝐭 thought about it for a moment before his eyes widened. 𝗬𝗲𝗍. He could talk to 𝗬𝗲𝗍 about it. He had the day off from school because of his ankle. 𝗬𝗲𝗍 was off from work today to babysit him, and his mom wasn't going to be home all day. It was perfect. 𝐬𝐡𝐭 opened the door and walked into the living room, stopping in his tracks when he spotted 𝗬𝗲𝗍 sitting on the couch. He seemed to have just crawled out of the massive blankets that were piled over a couch, rubbing his eyes and yawning. What are you doing here? He asked, lifting an eyebrow and sitting up straighter when he spotted 𝐬𝐡𝐭. He was obviously confused, and as soon as the words came out of his mouth, his eyes widened. Is everything okay? Well, 𝐬𝐡𝐭 stood there awkwardly and fiddled with the note in his hand. I wrote a note just to see if someone was actually waking up in my place, and they responded. They signed with their name, Mikumo. What? 𝗬𝗲𝗍 asked, his forehead wrinkling with confusion as he processed what 𝐬𝐡𝐭 had just said. Wait a minute. He paused, and his face flooded with realization as he remembered the conversation he had with Mikumo a couple of hours earlier. He leaned forward to focus better on the paper that was still clutching in 𝐬𝐡𝐭's hands. Hi, really, Mikumo? Why did it have to be now? 𝗬𝗲𝗍 murmured as he ran his hands through his hair. The question wasn't really directed at 𝐬𝐡𝐭, although it did catch him off guard. What is it? You know him? 𝐬𝐡𝐭 asked, taking a tentative step forward. 𝗬𝗲𝗍 looked up and sighed. I have a lot of explaining to do, kid. Sit down. 𝐬𝐡𝐭 sat down on the couch, looking over at 𝗬𝗲𝗍, curiosity burning in his eyes. He opened his mouth to ask him what he meant, but before he had a chance, 𝗬𝗲𝗍 looked down at the note with frustration, letting out a long breath before he let his head fall back and stared up at the ceiling. He let out a low sigh, as one would do when they were deep in thought. Finally, after about a minute of silence, he looked back at 𝐬𝐡𝐭. He let the tension in the air hang for a moment. Then he started speaking. I can't believe he's making me do this by myself, though I guess he can't really help it. 𝐬𝐡𝐭 frowned. Who? 𝗬𝗲𝗍 grimaced as if he didn't want to speak. Mikumo. Yes, he cut off 𝐬𝐡𝐭's exclamation. I know him. And I'm going to explain, I promise. Just hear me out. Reluctantly, 𝐬𝐡𝐭 relaxed a little and motioned for 𝗬𝗲𝗍 to speak. Okay, so, a little while before I started to live with you guys, I was at a convenience store, just wandering around. I was looking at the burn creams when a boy walked into the same aisle as me. Izuku's eyes widened. It was me, wasn't it? He breathed. But I don't remember that. It was you, but it also wasn't. It was Mikumo. It must have been late because as far as I know, he only wakes up when I'm asleep. Izuku shifted uncomfortably. 𝗑𝐻𝐿 nodded. Yeah, it was. He's a snarky little shit. He commented on my lack of hair dyeing skills before inviting me to live here after talking with me for not even 5 minutes. Izuku gaped. What, so you didn't save me? 𝗬𝗓 cleared his throat awkwardly. I'll get to that. Anyways, I wasn't really in the best place when he saw me. I was getting into more serious crime. And if he hadn't invited me to live here, then I would have been at the point of no return by now. He told me about his quirk, and I told him about mine. He mentioned wanting to learn how to fight, so I offered to teach him. 𝗑𝐻𝐿 paused and looked at Izuku, waiting to see if he wanted to comment, but he stayed quiet as he stared down at the note. Apprehensive, he continued. We made a plan, I guess, too. He cut himself off. Oh, wow, this sounds really bad. We made a plan that would end with 𝐀𝐻𝐿 inviting me to stay here, because even though she's the nicest woman I've ever met, there was no way she would invite a stranger to live with her without a good reason. Basically, the plan was to make it seem like you got attacked, and I saved you, so 𝐀𝐻𝐿 would have a reason to take me in. 𝗑𝐻𝐿 looked away. It worked, obviously, and I've been here ever since. Sometimes we'd sneak out and spar, so he could practice. He purposely left out the part of Mikumo being a vigilante. That was a conversation for another time. Izuku looked up from the note into 𝗑𝐻𝐿's eyes with a blank stare. Izuku's anger felt like a smoldering flame in his chest, the heat of it burning him up on the inside like he was going to explode. He felt as though he should scream, or shout, or cry, or maybe even all of those things at once, but he couldn't bring himself to do any of them. Instead, he just sat there, frozen to the spot he was sitting on, staring 𝗑𝐻𝐿 down in silence, too stunned to speak or react in any other way. Why, he whispered, why lie to me all this time? I've been thinking I've been going insane, for years. I had no idea what was happening to me, but you knew. You knew and you didn't tell me. Why? Izuku waited for 𝗑𝐻𝐿 to respond, his hands curled into tight fists in his lap as he stared at him. The silence was deafening. Every breath he took feeling heavier and louder than the last. He didn't know what he wanted or needed from 𝗑𝐻𝐿, whether it be the truth or an apology. But, after all this time, it seemed like nothing 𝗑𝐻𝐿 could say would make this any better or help him understand why he had to suffer alone, with no one to turn to. 𝗑𝐻𝐿 sighed as he looked at Izuku, his expression one of sadness. He wanted to look away, to avert his gaze, but he couldn't. He wanted to apologize, but he didn't know where to start. So, he just said the first thing that came to mind. I'm sorry, he said softly. Izuku looked at him incredulously. You're sorry, is that it? Sorry doesn't fix anything. Sorry doesn't undo the fact that I thought going insane. Sorry doesn't change the fact that you lied to me for weeks. He let out a bitter half-laugh, half-choked sob, staring at the man sitting in front of him as a few tears started to run down his face. He felt younger than he was, so angry and scared. The more he let his feelings bubble to the surface, the harder they were to contain, and they were all mixing together into something messy and overwhelming. His anger, his fear, his confusion, they all just kept on growing and growing, boiling up from deep inside him and threatening to spill over. I can't believe you, Izuku spat through his tears. He felt his anger rising, threatening to drown out all logic and reason. He wanted to lash out, to say something hurtful and cruel to 𝗑𝐻𝐿, who was clearly at fault for this whole mess. But all he could manage to choke out was a weak, I hate you, before he stood up and fled from the room, running out of the apartment and slamming the door behind him. Left alone in the apartment, 𝗑𝐻𝐿 slammed his fist into the couch as a wave of rage and disgust directed at himself overwhelmed him. He wanted to do something, scream, throw things, punch walls, but he found that he couldn't even muster up the energy to do that. Instead, he just sat there, alone with his thoughts and his anger. He just hoped Izuku would be okay. Izuku ran as best as he could down the sidewalk, unsure about how long he'd been running. Everything blurred past him, and the only goal he had in mind was to get as far away as possible. He was lucky that the hospital was able to use a healing quirk to heal his ankle about halfway, or else he wouldn't be able to walk so well. After a few minutes of running, Izuku eventually had to stop, taking a few deep breaths as his chest heaved and he tried to catch his breath. When he was finally able to breathe a little easier, he kept on walking, wandering through the city with absolutely no idea where he was going and no real goal in mind. After a while, he found himself in a park, on a bench, his mind a mess of thoughts and feelings about everything that had happened. He didn't know what to think or do or feel, and it was all so overwhelming. The fact that he was lied to for weeks by 𝗑𝐻𝐿 and years by Mikumo made his chest hurt. The more Izuku thought about it, the harder it was for him to breathe. He felt like he couldn't trust anyone anymore, and it was all just starting to get too much. The stress and tension and hurt, it was all just piling up on him and he wasn't sure how much longer he could take it. After a few more minutes of sitting on the bench, his head in his hands, he couldn't take it anymore. He stood up and immediately started running again. He chose a random direction, but eventually, he started seeing buildings he recognized. Looking up, Izuku realized the building in front of him was the hospital where he met Dr. 𝐀𝐦 yesterday. His mom had talked with the doctor before they left, and she scheduled a sleep study for the weekend. Dr. 𝐀𝐦 had made him a top priority, so they were able to get an appointment much faster. Jolting, he remembered that at the sleep study, his mom and all of the doctors would learn about 𝐴𝐻𝐽. He wasn't sure if he wanted this or not. As he was looking at the building, shouting started to ring out from down the street. The scene that greeted Izuku was chaotic. Several people ran past him, the sound of screams filling the air. The sounds of sirens and police cars getting closer gave a clear indication that the situation was going to get much worse before it got better, so he took the opportunity to hide away from the chaos behind some bushes. He peeked out and watched as a man with bombs for hands rode in the back of a truck, clutching onto a bag filled with money. "Huh," the villain barked out. "No heroes to be seen. This money's mine." From further down the street, a police officer stood up through the sunroof with his gun pointed at the villain. "Put the money down and put your hands up." As if. The villain laughed maniacally and raised his hands and pointed them at the buildings on either side of the street. "Try catching me when you have to save everyone else." Flexing his shoulders, the bombs shot off of his wrists like cannonballs and buried themselves into the walls of the building. There was a moment of silence before they exploded, showering the streets with pieces of debris. Izuku felt the explosion shake the ground under his feet, and for a second he thought the building in front of him was going to collapse. He looked up and saw a piece of debris falling toward him, so he scrambled out of the bushes, trying to move out of the way. But the falling rock was faster, and the next thing he knew he was hit by a massive force and his vision went black.